I think, I honestly want to start out this conversation by kind of bringing everybody back to, where we left the conversation off, essentially, right? And so, 2 years ago, we had you on the show. You were fresh off the Cassin Ridge, just had soloed that, made a huge name for yourself with that. And then for anybody listening that hasn't checked it out, go back and listen to that episode to give yourself kind of a good foundation for, who we're talking to today. But as we ended that conversation, you were, just getting into air sports. You had just started to have the passion for paragliding, and it kind of had like consumed your vision. And almost immediately, Max and I were kind of joking after the fact, like, dude, air sports are kind of dangerous. We really hope Nathan doesn't get injured. And I think it was 3 weeks. It was either 3 weeks or some like a very short amount of time. You crashed and you broke your pelvis. So, let's talk about that a little bit. I want to kind of branch that story out, give people a foundation for your introduction to flight sports before we talk into this objective today. So what happened after you talked to us? What was your introductory to flight sports like, and what ended up leading up to that accident?
Yeah, so like many pilots in sort of the Mountain West, I was introduced to paragliding at the Point of the Mountain in Draper, Utah. Um, we mostly just call it the Point or the flight park. It's a great place to learn and a great place to fly. It's a ridge soaring site, which for any non-pilots basically means there's a big hill and then there's consistent wind that comes up the hill. Air goes up the hill, your wing tries to go down, but the air is going up faster, and so you can float around on that column of rising air for hours as long as you want. Um, and you can't really go anywhere. You kind of just fly back and forth along the top of the hill because that's where the rising air is. But it's a really good site to just get a lot of hours in, to sort of learn the characteristics of how these wings work. And yeah, it's also just the conditions and the weather, the dry desert climate and the way the air masses move back and forth between these large valleys means that it's flyable almost every day. It's probably flyable 300 days a year. And so, yeah, it's a great place to learn. It's a great place to live as a pilot. And so, yeah, I knew, I already had some friends in some amount of community in Salt Lake and knew people who flew there and who flew the flight park a lot. And so I knew leading up to, my introduction to paragliding that when I did take that step that I wanted to learn at the flight park. There's several different schools that teach there. And so just asked around for a recommended instructor and got connected with Utah Paragliding. Instructor named Jonathan. He was absolutely fantastic. Took a course there. And that initial certification course to get the qualification level that's known as a P2 qualification. It's only I went through it pretty quickly, basically as quickly as I could. I wasn't working at the time, and so I was like, all right, Jonathan, like I just want to fast track this. I'm excited to be certified to fly on my own as quickly as possible. And so I went through that certification pretty intensively in about 2 weeks, basically flying with Jonathan all day every day for 2 weeks. And then got signed off on that. And with that certification, you're basically allowed to fly most sites on your own. It's basically just like a sign off, like you're qualified. Like if the conditions like you're basically you're qualified to make your own decisions of like evaluating the conditions and the site. And if you decide that they're within your flying ability, go for it.
Now, is that monitored? Like, do they have like, officers there checking your P2 status to like launch your wing, or is it more just kind of like you shouldn't be doing this without the P2?
Yeah, so some sites, yes. And to be clear, this only applies to sites that are insured by the sort of like the governing paragliding body, the U.S. Hang Gliding and Paragliding Association. By like the federal rules of aviation, anybody could go online and buy a paraglider and fly it off a mountain as long as it's in certain types of airspace.
Uh-huh.
Like you're not going to be arrested for that. But it's just like sort of like a self-governing thing that like USPA insured sites, which is pretty much any
Mm.
popular flying site in the U.S. You have to have the certification, and each flying site, as as a requirement to have that insurance, there has to be a sort of site monitor that is supposed to be making sure that everybody has that certification. Does that mean that everyone who flies at the point has a P2? Probably not. But a lot of people do it, and obviously I think it's it's good to have some amount of sort of accountability
100%. Yeah,
in the
I'm not
sport.
really
And
like
so
advocating for going up there without it. I was
yeah,
just curious
yeah.
as to the, the legislative service or how
But
that's
I
monitored. It's
mean, it
interesting.
is
Go ahead.
obviously, flying is quickly growing in popularity, but it's still like pretty small, pretty like either self-governed or ungoverned, depending on where you are. Like definitely a lot of people just sort of going out and doing what they want.
Two questions. First, for anybody interested in the P2 certification, you said you did it in 2 weeks. Quickly summarize the process in terms of costs, and what someone might expect if they're trying to get into the sport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so depending on the school and the program that you go through, it's probably going to be about $2,000 to $3,000 just for the instruction. Um, and let's see if I can get it off the top of my head. The requirements are something like at least 10 flying days, so flying on 10 different days, and then a certain number of hours. I think it's maybe like 30 or 40 hours, and then maybe like 30 or 40 flights. It's probably less hours, maybe like 20 hours and like 30 or 40 flights, as well as passing like a written test and then a skills test. So being able to, basically show that you can control the wing on the ground, launch, land, navigate in the air, and then do some like specific like descent techniques and things like that. But like for P2, it's almost like concerningly simple stuff. But I'm not super familiar, but my understanding is that the sort of equivalent certification to be allowed to go fly on your own in most European countries is much more involved to pass off.
Interesting. Would you say there's any sort of similarities with the certification process for skydiving?
I'm honestly not familiar, which is funny because I have a lot of friends that skydive and base jump and such, but I can't say that I really know the specifics of skydiving certifications.
Is tandem flying a part of the process of getting your P2?
No, and I've actually only been on one tandem flight, and it was months after I'd started flying. Not that it's not beneficial, but yeah,
It's not a
It's not
requirement.
required. Yep.
You had mentioned that the sport, paragliding and air sports in general, is kind of like this rapidly growing sport. How would you compare that to the sport of climbing and its growth in the past decade? Do you feel like it's kind of headed in that same direction of mass adoption and mass media, attention? Do you think it's kind of headed that direction?
Possibly. I don't know if it'll ever become quite as widespread as climbing because it will never be as accessible as and as safe as a climbing gym. Like there's not really any like advancement or like technology or like level
There's
of
no
passive
like
safety
gym to
in
crag or like
paragliding.
gym to
Exactly.
air or something.
There's
Yeah.
nothing that will make paragliding. There's never going to be a paragliding equivalent of a climbing gym
Got it.
where like
That makes
anybody can
sense.
take their 12-year-old kids there for a birthday party. That's just not going to happen. That being said, it definitely like it sort of feels with the explosion of popularity and all this new stuff being done all the time and sort of the excitement and energy around that, it does feel sort of like a golden age, like that you might equate to like Yosemite in the 70s and 80s or something like that with the free climbing golden age.
That's exciting. Hell yeah.
It is. It's super exciting. Yeah, I mean, it's really fun to be, and maybe not quite so much with cross country paragliding. Maybe there's pilots that would disagree with me on this. But like specifically like the speed flying and like the climb and fly stuff. Yeah, that really feels like it's sort of in like this like renaissance, if you will, this stage of development.
And that's mostly because you guys are applying it in new areas that have yet to be done.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Your injury, the pelvis smasher.
Yeah.
I read that you blacked out and no one witnessed it, so you can't really understand what happened. So, I mean, as much as you can, what happened?
There were some sort of like, I mean, I didn't talk to everyone that was on. Like, there were definitely other people flying on the hill, and it's a small site. It was the point kind of has two different like locations that you can fly, and it was on the smaller of the two. So it's this hill that's like, maybe half a mile wide at most, probably like a quarter mile wide. You can walk the whole top of it in 10 minutes easily. And there are definitely other pilots around. So I think some other people like sort of saw it. I was kind of flying on one end by myself. I never ended up with like a clear eyewitness account. But I have ideas of what went wrong. And I definitely have ideas of like contributing factors of the day that made it dangerous for me to be flying. But yeah, basically, so this was just a few more weeks out of my P2. So I've been flying for maybe 2 months at most at this point. And I had done a lot of flying in those few weeks. Like I said, because the point is such a consistent site, and I wasn't working. I was basically just living in my van on the top of the hill, and I could open up my door. You know, I could wake up in the morning and go from asleep to underneath the wing in the air in literally 5 minutes.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good life dirtbagging on top of Southside. Um, but yeah, so I was flying a ton, progressing quickly, becoming, you know, super confident with the site, super confident with the wing I was flying, and on it, just like having a time of my life. It was so much fun. I was just absolutely infatuated with flying. Um, and then yeah, was basically out on a morning with a little bit stronger wind, and at this time I had been flying pretty much since pretty quickly after getting out of school. I had been flying an 18-meter wing, so that's sort of a surface area of 18 square meters. And for reference, a full-size cross-country paraglider, or like a student paraglider that you would learn on, is going to be 22 to 26 square meters.
Okay, so significantly
Versus
larger.
yeah, versus like the smallest speed wings are single digit, so 8 square meters or 6 square
Holy hell.
meters.
Wow.
So
Okay.
you know, it's a broad range, and I was
Yeah.
still, you know, I was still in the upper part of that range in terms of you know, smaller wings, but it was definitely in the mini wing category. And what happens as you fly these smaller wings is they can be a little bit more difficult to handle, specifically in the sense that they're much more responsive. And so if you lean a little bit to one side or pull a little bit of toggle on one side, whereas a big wing would turn slowly that direction, a smaller wing will turn basically quicker. And
Are
that
you
makes
also
them,
falling faster?
yeah, so they definitely descend faster as well. And they also
Okay.
fly forward faster. So basically,
Okay.
just everything, all the movement is happening more quickly and more dynamically, which makes them really fun to fly. Um, it's sort of like driving maybe a minivan versus driving a little sports car as you get smaller down to the sizes.
But the
Um,
margin for error starts to get smaller and smaller.
exactly, and you have to
Yeah.
have more ingrained reactions, more natural reactions to be able to do what you need to do
Dexterity.
when you need to do
Mhm.
it. But yeah, so I've been flying this 18-meter wing, was feeling super confident on it, and was out flying this day where the wind was kind of at the upper wind speed limit of what I could soar this wing in. So with the mechanics of soaring, you know, the wind is coming up the hill and you're flying into it, and kind of the wind speed is canceling out the speed and descent of your wing. But once the wind speed gets faster than your wing can fly, you can no longer soar because you'll just get pushed backwards off the hill. Um, so I'd been flying all morning, and it had been a certain speed, and it was perfect soaring speed for this 18-meter wing. But then throughout the course of the morning, as is often the case at the point, the wind speed increased just a little bit, and that little bit of increase was enough to make it so I couldn't really fly very well on the 18. I was just getting like, you know, sort of just like floating, couldn't really fly back and forth. So the wind was just a little bit too strong for the wing. And so I landed, and of course was a little bit bummed because I love flying, and like other pilots were still out on smaller wings, and I was like, oh, they look like they're having so much fun. Um, and then another pilot on the hill, who I was sort of acquaintances with, he offered to let me borrow his wing, which was a 16-meter wing. So a little bit smaller, and then along with that, a little bit more dynamic, a little bit faster, and it would have been it was the perfect size for flying in that wind speed. And it was actually part of maybe sort of the fallacy of confidence there, was that it was actually the same model of wing as the one that I've been flying. So it's the exact same wing, same design. It looked the same. It was just a little bit smaller. And so I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Like I'll go stand on the lip. I'll kite it. I'll see how it feels. And if it feels good, I'll go fly it. So I did that. And of course, you know, kite on the lip for like all of like 3 minutes. Kiting, by the way, for any non-pilots, is just standing in the wind underneath your wing with your feet still on the ground, but you can kind of fly the wing above you.
Just get a
so
feel
yeah,
for it.
exactly. You can kind of pull it back and forth, and that's normally sort of the last step that you do before you start flying, is you kite the wing overhead, and then you step off the hill and start flying. So I'm kiting the wing, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is totally manageable. I got this. So I step off the hill and I start soaring this wing, and it was maybe like the most fun I've ever had. I was having the time of my life. I was like, oh, this is great. Like the wing feels familiar. It's just like a slightly faster, slightly more dynamic version of what I'm used to. This is sweet. It's like perfect for the wind speed. I can zip around so fast. Just having the time of my life. And so I flew that wing for maybe another like 20 or 30 minutes. Got quite confident on it in that time. And then some combination of factors led to me waking up on the hill.
Wow, it was that fast, huh?
Yeah. So I have sort of like several different hypotheses of contributing factors. Obviously, the more dynamic wing. It was getting a little bit later into the morning, and when it does, as the sun heats up the ground, it creates bubbles of thermic lift, which is what allows cross-country paragliders to cover long distances and fly hundreds of miles in a day, is this lifting air. But for a soaring site, those bubbles aren't great because they just introduce inconsistencies into the air. They don't form cohesive climbs. They kind of just get blown up the hill and you get little bits of turbulence. So it's getting into the time of the day that it starts to get a little bit bumpier. Most people start wrapping up flying for the morning around that time and then don't come back until the evening when it smooths out again. So yeah, starting to get a little bit thermic, a little bit bumpy. I was also flying over on one edge of the hill in this spot that we call the scoop, which is rather than like a smooth, planar piece of hill like most of the site, there's this spot where there's kind of a depression in the hill, which is a fun feature to sort of fly around in and like swing close to the terrain and sort of interact with this little bit more interesting piece of terrain. But because of the sort of the edges of it, it can form just little pockets of weird air coming up off the edges. And so I think, it could have been because of one of those pockets of turbulence. It could have been because of a thermic bit of turbulence, or it could have just been like 100% my own mistake. But through one of those factors, I do know that I was, and I distinctly remember that I was swinging some like steep dynamic turns, carrying energy from one turn to the next. And somehow one of those turns was either misjudged or the wing took some kind of collapse and would have just spun me into the hill with, and I forced to break my pelvis in the front, in the pubic symphysis. I got like a big sort of overlap like that.
Yep. Damn.
Yep.
How high were you off the ground in your last memory?
Not far at all, which was actually a contributing factor. Generally, it might be slightly counterintuitive, but the further away from the ground you are in paragliding, the safer you are.
The more stable it is, the air is.
Well, and just the more time you have to react to correct anything. Generally, nothing is going to happen when you're attached to a paraglider that results in like a true free fall. Like you're not going to get like detached from the wing and fall out of the sky.
It's not going to be like a full collapse and then you just start spinning to the ground or anything like that.
Well, that can happen where you get like the wing collapse in such a configuration that it spins into the ground or dives into the ground, but it's still not free fall. Like you're still attached to this giant piece of nylon that's inducing a lot of drag in some way. So being closer to the ground means that you have less time to react. And I was flying quite close to the ground, which is common at the soaring site because it's smooth air. And frankly, because it's a small hill, and just like the way the physics of the moving air work, you can't actually get that high above it. Like the highest I've ever seen someone above the hill at Southside is like maybe 200 feet. Most people fly like less than 50 feet above the ground there, just because that's how the mechanics of the site works.
Yeah, and it's not like speed flying where you're like going down the mountain. The wind is moving so fast up the hill that you're staying in place almost and just kind of playing left and right.
Yeah, so you're not really changing altitude very much. If this is a hill, you're kind of just like flying along it. And because the air is so smooth, it can actually be super fun. You can like you can fly so close to the ground that you can like drag your feet through the grass and stuff.
Wow,
it feels amazing. It's really great, and I still love flying this site. It's probably my favorite place in the world to fly. Even
did you ever get to the place where you're like doing barrel rolls?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Not at Southside. The hill at Southside is too small for that, but on a lot of other bigger mountain flights, yeah.
Wow, so sick. Okay, so you blacked out, you crushed your pelvis, you don't even know why it really happened, so you can't really I went through an injury, Max went through an injury. We were very coherent through the whole thing, and we were able to rationalize like why it happened, what went wrong. And it seems like in your situation, it's more of a guessing game, right? You have these hypotheses of kind of, okay, maybe what went wrong. Like, did you come at it in a very pragmatic approach and just like, okay, like these things could have gone wrong. These are the things I'm going to avoid. Let me like continue moving forward. Or did you have like some sort of realization of like, holy fuck, this is dangerous. Like, I don't really like, do I still have a passion for it? Like, did it question anything in terms of your belief for the sport? Or were you just like, no, I made my first fucking mistake and I'm ready to turn back and turn the page?
It definitely, it gave me some amount of pause and self-reflection on my approach to the sport, but it didn't put the smallest dent in my passion for it. Like I remember being in the hospital and basically like, I was in a ton of pain, like, you know, all this things going on, all these stressful things going on. And pretty much the whole time I was in the hospital for like a week, and pretty much the only thing I could think about for that week's day was like how much I wanted to start flying again. And how I basically would just like do whatever I needed to recovery, specifically so that I could be back in the air as soon as possible.
I think that's a pretty common thing,
Yeah.
in
I mean,
these sports.
It's just one of those things that the combination of like intense experience, but also control over that experience, and movement, and just like unique way of experiencing the world in the mountains, it's just so massively addicting and just wildly fun. Yeah.
So like, did you have any key lessons in terms of your techniques or things to avoid kind of making that happen again? Because if not, I would imagine it would all be chalked up to luck.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the biggest takeaway was one of sort of emotional awareness, and like keeping emotions in check and putting a little bit of a meter on that. One of my distinct memories, like from before I crashed, before I blacked out, was just like ecstasy to the point of like like problem, like drug induced ecstasy.
Euphoria. Yeah.
Exactly, that's a great word for it. And like obviously flying should be fun, but I think that was a good lesson that if it ever feels like so extreme and like so much input that you're reaching this state of just like blurry minded euphoria, that it's too much too soon. So in a way, your flights should like in order for safe, manageable progression and experience in the sport, your flights they shouldn't be boring, but they should almost be boring. They should be enjoyable and satisfying, but it should feel so within your realm of ability that it's a little bit boring.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're having to digest all of this information that's happening, and when these small little cues happen, that are signals for things going wrong, if you're so blasted with euphoria that you can't register it to respond fast enough to fix the problem, then you might black out and hit the ground. Yeah. Interesting, man. Well, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you're okay. I saw that happen and I was just like, fuck, I can't believe that happened, but yeah, it definitely seemed like you turned around, and then, the next thing I knew, you were in New Zealand. It seemed like a really quick turnaround. I know it's been 2 years, but you've been in New Zealand for how long now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually visited New Zealand. So my accident was in November. I visited, and so I was out for close to 2 months. And then I came and visited New Zealand the following March, which was a year ago. So March of 2024. And I was here for just 3 weeks that time. And then I was back in the States until November 2024, which is when I came here for this project. So now I've been in New Zealand for almost 4 months.
Okay. So you haven't been
but
there.
My first time coming here was about a year ago. Yep.
Now, so what's, something you said in the last episode at the end, you said paragliding is the future of round trip mountain travel. It seemed like you did. It seems like you already had the vision for what you have already accomplished. Yeah. Even if you knew it or not. Like, how did the vision start for New Zealand? Why New Zealand and not another country, another set of mountain ranges? Talk to me specifically about why this objective is the one you chose to go with.
So I visited in March. I actually just kind of ended up tacking on to the spring break trip of my good friend Jason Hardrath. So he was coming down, and this is actually he has recently started flying himself. But this
Yeah, I
was
saw
before
that.
he'd started flying. But he just wanted to do a spring break trip. He wanted to go somewhere that would like have mountains that were just like fun and accessible, but just like nothing too rugged. He basically wanted to just like come and do some like nice mellow trail running and like hang out by the lake. And I was like, oh, that sounds great. Like I'll figure out a way to come join. And so his 1 week trip ended like I booked for that week and then ended up extending for a week on either side, and it turned into a 3 week trip. Basically because I realized that the speed flying and mountain flying potential here was huge. And so yeah, I came down, met a bunch of the local pilots, flew with some of the local pilots, and ended up doing a couple little sort of like mini climb and fly projects. Most notably, one that we made a little short film about, which was sort of a round trip speed record, kind of like a run and fly, climb and fly thing on Mount Aspiring, which is one of the 3,000-meter peaks here. It's super prominent, really gorgeous mountain, and basically went round trip from the car park to the summit and back faster than anybody had before by using a wing. Actually wasn't that much faster than the round trip foot record, which is a very impressive time set by a local
Wow.
climber and runner.
Wow. Wow.
So I was slower than him on the ascent, but obviously had the massive advantage of a fast wing to get back down.
Is there a specific thing or like a specific thing that makes this area so prone and like really nice for this kind of climb and fly situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of I expect that a lot of your listeners are from the Mountain West, and generally speaking, the mountain ranges there. So like the Sierra Nevada, for example, they have high peaks, but they also have quite high plateaus in between those peaks. And so maybe you'll get parts of the ranges, for example, the eastern escarpment of the Eastern Sierra Range, where you get big vertical relief, but then like sort of there's maybe like an internal part of the range that doesn't, it's kind of like a high plateau. So I think about a lot of Colorado, for example, as well, where you have all these 14,000 foot peaks, but the valleys in between those peaks are at 11,000 feet. So it's not actually that much like steep vertical relief. Whereas the mountains in New Zealand, just because the way they've formed geologically and with the glaciation here, there's not really any continuous high plateaus. So it's these relatively high peaks, and they all have super deep valleys in between them. And these valleys are really steep walled. The peaks are dense, but they have really deep valleys in between them. And basically, that vertical relief means that you can fly, do these huge flights off of most of the mountains here, where you're doing maybe like 6, 7, 8,000 vertical foot flights. And some of these are 8,000 vertical feet in like, less than 2 horizontal miles. There's just big steep descents, and it's like the peaks themselves aren't that high. Like I mentioned, there's 24 3,000 meter peaks, and those are the highest peaks here. So Mount Cook, for example, is just over 12,000 feet. That's the highest peak in the country. But the valleys in between these peaks are like sea level, effectively. So
yeah. Do you know like what geographically caused the dramatic vertical relief between the troughs and the peaks out there?
I don't know exactly. I think it's on the west side. It's more to do with extensive glaciation, and then I would suspect on the east side of the crest, just something about the way there is a really dramatic and really active fault line just on the west side of the mountains, and I would just suspect something about the way that the sort of the compression and the folding is happening.
And New Zealand itself is an island. It's like a big, long, kind of like a parabolic shaped island. Is there like a big vertical relief under the sea as well? Like, is it just a big drop off the shore, or is it kind of like this seabed that sticks out?
I think into the Tasman, yes, on the west side of the South Island. There's and I'm not a geologist, so you're gonna have to take this with a grain of
I'm
salt.
not either. I'm trying to get some information.
I
Yeah.
think there's a big trough on the west side, and then not quite as deep on the east side. And it is. I do have to correct you just a little bit. New Zealand is 2 islands. There's
Two
the
islands,
South
my bad.
Island, which is much more mountainous, and that's where
Okay.
95 of my 100 peaks were. But there's also the North Island, which is has much more of the country's population. So I think like 80% of the population of New Zealand lives on the North Island.
Interesting.
Yep.
Okay, so there's 100 peaks in this list, right?
Mm-hmm.
What qualifies a peak to be in the 100?
Good question. I feel like I want to provide a little bit of context for like what I look for in these sort of peak list projects that I've done several of now somehow. So
I would say it's pretty planned out at this point.
yeah. So I'd done 2 previously. One of which was the Washington Bulgers list, which it's not exactly this, but it's basically the 100 highest peaks in Washington. It's what they thought were the 100 highest peaks when they made the list. It's a historic list. It's a very like in the weeds peak bear thing, but it's the 100 highest peaks in Washington. And then the second one that I did, the SPS list, had nothing to do with height and was just a selection by the Sierra Club of the peaks that they thought were sort of interesting or geographically significant or culturally significant. Just peaks that they thought were like worth climbing, essentially. And so the New Zealand Alpine Club 100 Peaks Challenge, which is sort of the full name of the list that I was working on down here.
Say it one more time.
The New Zealand Alpine Club's 100 Peaks Challenge.
Okay.
Yep, the 100 Peaks Challenge. And yeah, so that was more similar to the SPS list in that it was just a set of peaks chosen by members of the Alpine Club because they thought that they were interesting, notable, geographically or culturally significant, or generally worth climbing. So a lot of the highest peaks are on the list. So obviously Aoraki, Mount Cook, Mount Tasman, most of the 3,000 meter peaks are on the list. Not all of them, but there's also a lot of peaks that are much shorter that wouldn't be on a list of the highest 100 or 200 or 300 or probably even 400 peaks in New Zealand, but they still might be quite prominent, or might be just like particularly aesthetic or well known. So one that comes to mind, for example, is Mitre Peak, which is just above Milford Sound. Milford Sound is one of the most spectacular places on Earth. It's this essentially imagine Yosemite Valley, except for the walls are covered in vegetation and there's ocean in the middle instead of meadows.
Like a Norwegian fjord.
Absolutely, yeah. It's this huge deep fjord, and so it's framed by 2 peaks, Mitre Peak and Pembroke Peak, and both of them are like barely 2,000 meters, but they're both on the list because they're it's part of this iconic view, this iconic New Zealand scene.
Between the 2 styles of selection, top 100 tallest versus the 100 selected peaks, do you have like a favorite kind of style choosing the list?
Oh, the latter for sure.
The latter. Yeah. I would imagine the latter is like it's a curated list. Like these are the most aesthetic peaks,
Well, and just because of sort of the way that mountain building works, if you're going to pick the 100 highest, they're almost always going to be super concentrated in one part of the range.
Interesting.
So for the Bulgers list, for example, it's very heavily concentrated in like the northeast part of the North Cascades, which is a great part of the range, but you're only seeing like a quarter of the range when you're climbing all those peaks. There's all these great peaks on the west side of the crest, like Mount Index comes to mind, for example, that are super rugged, more challenging than most of the peaks that are on the list, but just because of the shape and the structure of the range are nowhere close to the 100 highest. So yeah, the Southern Alps in New Zealand are similar, where there's a very dense sort of cluster of high peaks right around Aoraki. And they're all quite high. They're all aesthetic peaks, but some of them are kind of just like bumps on a ridge next to a higher peak. And so if you picked out the 100 highest, you would only be climbing in this one isolated or this one
And you could
concentrated section.
potentially do like 10 in like a mile range.
Yeah,
or
you're like
something
traversing
like
a ridge. Versus this list was distributed throughout both islands and throughout the whole sort of range on the south island of the whole Southern Alps. And so yeah, it introduced a lot more diversity, a lot more different styles of climbing, and just takes you to a lot of places that you wouldn't go otherwise.
Now, I would imagine these lists were curated in a way to achieve all of them, right? That was kind of like the initial vision in a way. I would imagine that would be the case.
Yes, I don't have exact numbers for you, but in 1991, when they made the list, several of the peaks on the list had only been climbed by like a couple parties.
Okay, so there were even were there some peaks in that list that had yet to be climbed?
They were all climbed. They'd all been climbed.
All climbed. Okay.
But some were very, very seldom climbed.
Got it. And I think the first man to put them all together was Don French, right?
This is correct. Yep.
And it took him 30 years?
I think 34 ended up being
34
his
years.
So,
Sorry,
yeah,
Don. Sorry. 34 years. I think you met him too, right?
Yeah. So we had dinner together. And yeah, I spent a great evening at his place going through his photo albums and exchanging stories. And yeah, he's a wonderful person. He was really a pleasure to be around and to exchange stories. And when I met him, it was really close to the end of the project. I was when I was on the North Island, and I was maybe 90 or 92 peaks in. And he was super, super gracious. Obviously, he was like a massive inspiration to me in planning. He's actually an article about him is the reason that I found out about the list to begin with.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
So it was a really sort of special moment to be able to kind of exchange gratitude with him of like, oh, like I'm so appreciative of him inspiring me to do this list, and then he was equally appreciative of being able to sort of follow along in this new style.
Did you reach out to him when you saw his article in the first place?
I did, yeah, but it actually we played a little bit of kind of email tag before we actually really got in contact, and then exchanged some messages, and then I finally actually got to talk to him on the phone for the first time when I was already well into the list. I think I was close to 50 peaks in when I talked to him on the phone for the first time. It was a difficult time to get a hold of me when I was finalizing planning and starting out, because I was just like deeply immersed in the planning. But yeah, Don's great, and I'm pretty happy to consider him a friend now.
Hell yeah. Other than his, completion of the list, is there any sort of historical information or lore about this list that you read about or considered before kind of really locking into this objective?
There's definitely some. There's only a handful of people that are like really actively working on it. I think it's only maybe I think 4 or 5 of us that have done more than 50. But yeah, so I did as much research as I could. The peaks in like New Zealand does have a really long and rich history of mountaineering. But even with that, it's still quite difficult to find information on some of these peaks and some of these especially the more obscure peaks and the more seldom climbed routes. A lot of it is stuff that's and interestingly enough, Don has this like huge library of like hard copy stuff, just like binders of like like photocopied journal entries and stuff. So there is definitely a lot of material out there, but it's kind of difficult to find and to access, and a lot of it's not on the internet. Me being a mountaineer and child of the technology age, I was just doing all of my research online, and a lot of the stuff is just hard to find online.
There's a lesson there.
Yeah, definitely. We had a couple of really entertaining exchanges, Don and I, about like him watching my dot like going up some route on some peak that like he knows never gets climbed because it's totally horrendous, because he like has the journal entry from the one party that did it, and knowing that it's easier to climb from the other side, but the information's not available anywhere. So I had no idea. And I'm just like up
Oh,
there, like epicing. And then he's like, oh, yeah, like you should have climbed it from Newland Stream. Like it totally goes that way.
you're like, you should have responded to my email in the first place, Don.
Yeah. But I mean, it's hard to just ask someone, like, hey, like, tell me how to climb all of them. But honestly, like, so I love the planning and sort of the untangling the puzzle part of these projects. I love that almost as much as I love being in the mountains. Just like looking at this map, this like somewhat blank slate, or like this logic puzzle of 100 dots on a map, and then figuring out based on my knowledge of how mountains work and like a little bit of information that I get from routes, but also just like looking at the map and the satellite imagery and drawing all these lines and connecting everything, just like untangling this mess of peaks. So I wouldn't want an instruction manual. That for me, that would take away a pretty significant part of the joy of these projects.
Well, also, I think that at this point, you're introducing a completely new style that has yet to be brought to these mountains, right? And so it's almost like that information might be misguided. So let's talk about, preparation and logistics. I think that, just like you said, as much as you enjoy it, I think it's a really understated portion of these objectives that you did. Even, the two, the Bulger's List and the Sierra Peak section. Is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Listening back to that conversation, half the battle was logistics. It was, for the Sierra Peak section, it was permits. So for this one, how did you lay it out on the table? How did you map this out with this new element of bringing a wing? Like, how prepared were you? How much of this puzzle was in place before you started going after it versus, the holes that were there that you were going to choose to fill along the way?
Yes. So one like pretty significant difficulty of introducing the climb and fly style to it is that like you never know for sure if you're going to be able to fly off a peak. And even if you can fly off the peak, you never know for sure what the conditions of the day are going to be. Wind direction, thermic activity, all these different air movements can dramatically affect where you can fly, where you can safely fly, how far you can glide, where on the mountain you can launch from. There's just just this whole laundry list of unknowable factors.
And it's also a medium that's invisible.
Exactly. Yeah. 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 You can't see moving air. Although the mountains here are generally pretty humid, and so there's a lot of cloud development, and so you can like watch the clouds form. You can watch them move. But that's getting into the weeds. Basically, before I started, I had at least one climbing route mapped out on every single peak. A lot of them I had 2 or 3 different approach options. Just like lines drawn from wherever I could drive a 2-wheel drive car to, because that was my weird little style point. Up whatever valley to get to this peak, and then to that peak and to that peak. So I had lines for the foot travel for every single peak. And then I also had a bunch of lines that I'd drawn for sort of like hypothetical flights. Like, if the conditions are right, I can fly from this summit to this glacier or down to the valley here. And from this summit, I can fly to here to here. And there were a couple obvious sets where there's like, maybe 3 peaks right in a row. So like my first link up comes to mind, which was the Mueller Glacier link up. So there's 3 peaks all kind of surrounding the head of this glacier. And it's pretty obvious. It's like, if I could climb this one, then I can fly to here, climb this one, fly to here, climb this one, then fly back to the car. So I had a handful of those sort of like link ups, just like isolated link ups of a few peaks. Whereas like, if I can do these on a day where I can fly wherever I want, whenever I want, this would be a really efficient way to do it. But then I had a lot of other peaks where it's like, I'm not sure like how, where I would fly to if I flew off this, but these are my options. I could fly to this valley, or out here. So there's I definitely had a really good sort of like framework established, especially for the climbing on foot. Like I basically knew how I would climb every mountain if I was just doing them on foot. And then sort of had this a little bit more nebulous, ideas of where I could fly. Yep.
Now, what are the considerations you have to account for? Because, we just talked about you can't see the air.
Mhm.
Are there like mapped air patterns for these valleys where you can be like, okay, like the air flows in this direction and it's most likely going to go up this cliff face? Like, how much wind or air information do you have going into these areas?
Yeah, so that definitely comes more from just experience and knowledge from flying in the mountains. The way that air moves through valleys, the way that it interacts with terrain, the way that it will change throughout the course of the day as things heat up and then cool back down, and how different directions of upper elevation wind will affect the way the air is moving through the valleys and through the mountains. Um, a lot of that is, regionally specific or specific to a range. So, for example, in the New Zealand mountains, and this is stuff that I was kind of aware of from reading online materials and talking to local pilots going into the project, but something that I obviously learned a lot more about throughout the course of the project. But like a nuance of the New Zealand mountains is that if the wind is coming from the northwest, which is perpendicular to the crest of the range, it will often sort of like pour over into the valleys and it will blow really strong down the valleys. Versus if it's from the southwest, like less than a 90-degree shift, it'll be more parallel to the crest of the range and it won't do that. And there's all these like really specific things that can result in, you know, very similar conditions on top of a mountain where it could be like reasonably light winds, totally launchable. But in the valley down below, it could be also calm, or it could be 30-mile-an-hour wind or 40-mile-an-hour wind. And it's hard to know. But with time in an area and like learning for the different signs, the different sort of like types of days and types of weather patterns, you start to see sort of the trends and learn a lot more about that.
So did you pick your specific, so I'm trying to like paint this picture here. So you have a map,
Mm-hmm.
you got 100 peaks, you've
Mm-hmm.
already mapped the ascents for each of them, and you've mapped, we'll call them dotted lines for projected flight patterns that you think you could do to make certain link ups. Did you pick like, okay, I'm going to pick the easiest, give me link up to test the area, to test the wind patterns and kind of introduce myself to this area first,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of get more towards these more complicated question mark objectives? Did you kind of tackle it that way?
To a certain extent, yeah. And the one that really comes to mind is the one that I already brought up, the Mueller Glacier link up. That was like a single day. It was an area that I'd already been in a little bit before, so I was like somewhat familiar with the terrain and the geography there. And it was also something that like if any of the flights didn't work, it would be pretty straightforward to get out on foot. Like it wasn't like super committing, whereas like I need to fly off any of these peaks. So that one was sort of like the first like real test of like the mini wing link up style. Um, and so when that one worked, it was definitely a really big sort of like realization light bulb moment. It's like, oh, like, you know, if I got a day, the forecast looked like this, and then this link up worked. It's like if I can look for more days with a similar forecast, I could also do this, I could do this, I could do this. So that was really kind of eye opening of like, oh, like, all these ideas that I've had that seem like kind of out there and like a little bit absurd, like, this one worked. And so like there's not really any reason that this wouldn't work, this wouldn't work, this one.
Yeah.
So that was a big one. That is definitely a lot of like, in the days right after that, it was a lot of like very excited, like going back through the maps, and it's like, oh, like this one works. So like, how can I apply
Yeah,
that?
you're like copying and pasting the style that worked to different link ups.
Yeah, to some extent, yeah.
Um, Terrain traps. So
Mhm.
as a climber, as an alpinist, we talk about bergschroons, crevasses, seracs, objective hazards. What is that like in the alpine air? What kind of terrain traps are you looking for? What are the invisible killers?
Yeah, so the main thing that will make flying dangerous is turbulent air, which, as a general rule, is caused by move air that is moving and interacting with an object that is moving differently. So the most straightforward is just wind coming over a ridge. The ridge isn't moving, the air is moving, and it's just like an eddy in water. So if the air is coming from this side, it flows up the ridge, it comes off the point, and then back on the backside of that, you get this swirling, turbulent air. A lot of it's going down, a lot of it's mixing. And if you fly your wing through an area like that, rather than just flying nice and straight, your wing might start to get tossed around. You might go, sink dramatically or get lifted back up dramatically. Or the most dangerous thing is you can start to take what are called collapses. Paragliders are there's no rigid structure. They're just strings and nylon, which is part of why they're fantastic, because it makes they can be really light. You can pack them into a pack, but it means that the only thing that gives them structure is the air moving into the leading edge. And if there's any interruption in that air caused by like a sudden change of the angle of attack on the wing moving through the air, or the way the air is flowing over the surface of the foil, that leading edge can essentially close, and the wing can lose its rigidity and lose its shape. And now, instead of the nice rigid airfoil above you that's giving you lift, you just have a messy, pile of nylon and strings that is not a wing. And so if you aren't able to sort that out and get it reinflated before you interact with the ground, you're going to be in bad shape. Fortunately, paragliders are these incredible pieces of engineering that have quite good passive safety, and with a combination of ability and active piloting and just the design of the paraglider, these collapses very often just pop right back out.
Wow.
Yep.
I would think from a completely ignorant point of view, I would think that you're riding with your foil, you've got air flying opposite of your direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
To provide lift.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen if all of a sudden the wind changes directions and now it's blowing from behind you? Like, does the foil act in both directions, or is it a singular movement pattern?
So if the wind coming from behind you was smooth, if there was like no abrupt sort of changes in the air, so if you were flying into headwind and then you like did a smooth headwind and then you did a 180-degree turn, or if that wind just somehow magically just like switched directions but smoothly, it would be totally fine. What would change would be your relative ground speed, because the wing doesn't know anything about the ground. It's only interacting with the air around it. So if the wing is in smooth air, it doesn't matter if it's 100-mile-an-hour wind or 0-mile-an-hour wind. If that's smooth, consistent, the wing is happy. The thing that changes is your movement relative to the ground. So, my wing, the wing that I use for most of this project, flies about 35 miles an hour if I'm flying straight and level, maybe 40. So if I'm flying into a 40-mile-an-hour headwind and I look down, the ground's not moving. If I was flying with a 40-mile-an-hour tailwind, I would be going 80 miles an hour above the ground. But the wing would be happy regardless. So no amount of like tailwind is going to collapse your wing, because it's just going to move even faster through the air. The thing that will cause issues is that turbulence. So when there's bits of air that are moving differently to each other right next to each other.
Got it. Yep. Okay, that makes sense. So
other things, like I said, the most straightforward is a ridge where it's creating that eddy behind. But this turbulence can also be caused by thermic air, which when the sun warms out the surface, there's lifting and sinking bits that are moving past each other. That can also be a common cause for big collapses.
Okay, so we talked about gear a little bit. You talked about your wing. What other gear specifications were you focused on making sure that this objective happened? Like, were there other key elements in gear that you needed to make sure?
Yeah. I mean, my kit definitely varied quite a bit depending on sort of the type of terrain I was in. There's, like I mentioned earlier, there's a huge variety in these mountains. But the most gear intensive was certainly sort of the high peaks of the Southern Alps, the central peaks, where they're sort of, it's true alpine terrain. They're steep and icy and heavily glaciated. And I have a number of years of experience in terrain like that, alpine climbing now, and so I was basically just looking to dial in a kit that was as light and packable as possible, to make it the most manageable for flying with, and just to make it easier to carry and cover big distances and significant amounts of vert. And yeah, mostly used gear that I'd used before, stuff that I already had. I think the most significant notable change to my kit was getting 2 new ice tools. They're sort of like a hybrid lightweight mountaineering but also somewhat technical tool, which is the Petzl Gully. I think they're becoming quite popular, especially with ski mountaineers and other climbers doing stuff that's like technical to a certain extent, but not like full on hard alpine climbing. So they're technical enough that you can swing them, you can climb vertical ice if you need to. They're really comfortable in like sort of mixed, like moderate, steep snow, steps of vertical ice, terrain like that, which is a lot of what these routes were in these peaks in New Zealand, where there's like sections of vertical ice or steep ice, but it's mostly just sort of like sustained, like moderate, like 60-degree ice and snow type of stuff. They're a great tool for that.
No skis.
No skis. Yep. So I started on November 17th, which would be the equivalent of North American, like I think mid-May or
So it's like
June, maybe mid-June.
Going into summer.
Yeah, it's like spring conditions going into summer conditions.
So no powder, no big storms.
Yeah.
You're just dealing with ice pack.
In the first month, I did have a couple pretty significant storms. Not a significant amount of like cold, dry snow that fell. A lot of those storms came down as like wet snow turning to rain and then everything freezing together. So any post-holing that I was doing was generally in like wet, melting afternoon snow and not dry powder.
In terms of choosing the wing itself, we talked a little bit about in the beginning, we talked to the differences between, smaller and larger wings. What about what about the environment and about this objective made you choose the size of wing that you went with for this objective?
Yes. So talking about the wing, I sort of have to address the style that I took with the flying. Basically, like a full-size paraglider, a cross-country wing, can be used to fly hundreds of kilometers. It can be used to fly over like people have flown like right up next to the summit of K2 after launching from the village in the valley.
Whoa! Wow.
And like it takes an extremely skilled pilot to do something like that, to launch that low and to fly up and over a massive mountain, but it's possible. So I kind of decided early on, and I've done some cross country flying. I'm not going to pretend that I'm experienced. I'm objectively a like novice to early intermediate cross country pilot. But I decided early on, just if you start using a big wing, it kind of gets all like nebulous of like it just becomes more of a conditions game of like trying to just like find the right day that you could go tag like 20 summits in a row, flying a big cross country in between them, just getting lift the whole way. And so I decided pretty early on that I wanted to incorporate flying, but I wanted it to be strictly descent flying. That's kind of what I was more familiar with. And to me, that was more aesthetic, in that I would be using the wing and it would be adding efficiency, but I wouldn't be using the wing to climb a mountain. It's like hypothetic. Yeah, a great pilot, you could climb 500 feet up a little hill on a really thermic day. You could launch and you could fly up to the top of a mountain and then fly back down.
You're no longer a climber at that point, though, right?
Yeah. So I knew that I wanted it to be a climbing focused project, using the wing to supplement that.
Well, I think I had mentioned this in the last podcast, but I think that, at least to me, the most glorious form of climbing is to climb up and then to fly down, right? Because as climbers, we're there for the ascent. We want to tag the summit. We want to have the experience of the climb.
Absolutely.
And then no one talks about the descent. Other than, oh, the descent's the most dangerous. Oh, most people die on the descent. Like no one talks about, man, the descent was the best fucking part. I am so psyched about that. Like no one talks about that until they're in your shoes and you actually get to fly down.
Well, and then with most sort of hike and fly paragliding or speed flying, nobody talks about the climb because they just went and did something non-technical. They hiked up and then they talk about their super rowdy descent. They're like, oh, like I was so pitted, it's so rad. So yeah, climb and fly in a way, like if you can get that perfectly with great conditions to like get a fantastic climb and then also fly the terrain and do like proper speed flying on the descent, and you can have both, like that's as good as it gets.
Wow.
In my opinion. But yeah, so I decided that I didn't want to do a full-size paraglider. And yeah, so basically I was looking at a wing that would be lightweight, it would be easy to launch from technical places. A lot of these peaks are super steep, no easy ascent, just like these rocky ridges or icy ridges, with very steep faces on all sides. So I knew that it had to be something that I could launch easily from anywhere, and that would be fun to fly, because I like wings that are dynamic and fast, but also something that wouldn't just fly straight down. So like the smallest speed wings, they're super fun to fly. They're super fast. They're like little go-karts. But you can't really go anywhere if you try to glide. Like they get pretty terrible glide because they're so small. They're like a
You
small
have to
step
move
up.
fast.
Yeah, they're like a small step up from wingsuits. So that you launch them from the top of the mountain and they just fly down. And you can do barrels the whole way down, but they are going down. So I knew that it needs to be not a speed wing, not a full size, and so there's sort of this nice in between niche, which is also the kind of wing, incidentally, that I broke my pelvis on, which are called mini wings. So they're in between the size. They're shaped more like a conventional paraglider with a higher aspect ratio, so they're kind of long and thin compared to speed wings, but they're closer to the size of speed wings. So I used a Nova Bantam 12, which is a 12 square meter mini wing. It weighs like 1.5 kilograms, so whatever that is in pounds, 4 pounds. And if you turn it and dive it, it goes really fast. If you fly straight, it gets really good glide. It's lightweight. It's got short lines. It's really easy to launch, and it's just a really versatile, awesome wing.
Hell yeah! I would imagine that climbing is already an expensive sport. Paragliding, an expensive sport. You in our last episode, you had mentioned that you we're in between careers, really weren't working very much. How did you fund this objective?
Good question. So after the Bulgers list and before the SPS list, a gentleman who lives here in New Zealand, who's now a good friend of mine named Dan, reached out to me, and he basically said that he thought the Bulgers list was awesome, and he was interested in mountain climbing. He'd done some in his past, and had a lot of like tech experience, and wanted to like put together this sort of project with tracking that could be an experience that could be shared with a lot of people. And so he financially supported both the SPS list and this New Zealand project to a pretty significant extent. While I was out climbing, he built a website for both these two projects that had like live tracking and information about the peaks, and published photos and things like that. He ran my social media for this. So
he's the gentleman who set up this recording.
Correct. Yep. And he has a place here in Wanaka. It's been a little bit of a home base for me throughout this project, as a place to stop in and do laundry and get a shower. So obviously, like, he's been enormously helpful. And yeah, big financial support. There's also a significant amount of support from Cedar Wright's Dirtbag Fund. He's actually now partnered with Dan with that.
Cool.
So yeah, he's put together this nonprofit. Cedar Wright, of course, well-known American Yosemite dirtbag climbers, now based in Boulder. So before this project, I got to meet with Cedar, and so he has this dirtbag fund, which is specifically geared towards kind of up and coming climbers with big ideas. And then I also got a grant from the American Alpine Club, and then put in just a decent chunk of my own money that I'd earned working as a trail running guide.
Very cool.
Yep.
It's awesome that the support has been there for you. It seems like a lot of these objectives would be kind of really hard to do without it. In terms of Dan's case, do you know what he does for a career? Like, in terms of just fronting his cash for an objective for an obscure climber, where is his passion in it?
So in terms of career, he's a tech guy. He works in computer science and software development. He's from California originally, and so he's hesitant to discuss the details, and so I don't pry. But he's in some companies in like the Silicon Valley .com boom, and seems to have done quite well with some of those. In terms of the mountain climbing, yeah, he's just sort of a hobbyist mountaineer, and the way that he's expressed his support to me, and he's supported some other climbers and some other projects as well, it is sort of as like a like a patron of the arts. So in I think it originated like maybe like medieval times where like a king would like host an artist and would like house and feed them and just like enable them to just like paint all the time,
Yeah, paint for
to
me. Yeah.
exactly to create these beautiful things. um and so yeah, like he knows that love climbing mountains, and he enjoys sort of like watching this thing be created. And so yeah, it's a very mutually beneficial sort of symbiotic relationship.
That's really cool. I really
Yeah,
like to hear that. It's
yeah,
interesting. It's cool to, I don't know if is philanthropy the right word? I don't know, because it's just, it's cool to see someone who has found their way, found their cash, found their stability, chosen to live wherever they want, and now still have the freedom to literally just cherry pick people that inspire them and to help support them. Like, to me, that is the dream, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the
No,
dream. To be able to do that is really cool.
yeah, yeah, and it's yeah, like I can see that he enjoys it and he also gets a lot out of it, and so yeah, I just feel really, you know, humbled and grateful that he's supported me in the way that he has.
It's really cool. It's awesome to hear. Okay, so before we dive into some of the specific moments on this list, I'd like to talk about one more logistic question, and that is the weather.
Mhm.
How did you account for weather? Was it a big consideration in terms of choosing these objectives?
So it's kind of funny. Going into this, obviously I watched as much content as I could find, watched all these different films about climbing in New Zealand and read all these trip reports. And like the general consensus from all these is that like the mountain weather in New Zealand is totally heinous. Like there's Patagonian storms that ravage the peaks on a weekly basis, and like it's like just all this like you're gonna die kind of stuff. Um, which I'm sure a lot of seasons is totally true, but I think with a combination of like quite good luck and then also just like good planning around the storms that did come through, like I had really nice weather. I did climb. I climbed a handful of peaks and storms, and I did wait out a couple very impressive storms in some of the Alpine huts, which is another tangent that I'd like to get on at some point. Um, but yeah, basically, and some of the local climbers agreed on this, that the weather was definitely better than average, and that combined with like really, watching it really closely and just picking the better days to go for the bigger peaks on, meant that I was mostly climbing in pretty nice conditions.
What do they say? Like luck is best found through preparation, or
Yeah,
something like that. You need to
yeah.
like there's probably a better way to say that, but I think you get what I'm saying.
And I did feel like throughout the project that was like there were just a ton of examples of that, of like things that worked out really really well and felt super lucky, but there's definitely a significant contributing factor to that luck of having put in a lot of preparation and
Mhm.
analysis and critical thinking, and just like also just like being in the right place at the right time.
Totally.
Yep.
Being in a position of, it's almost like gambling, right? You're like, all right, I'm going to put myself out there and be in the position so that if I'm lucky, it's perfect.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So last thing about logistics. So, weather seems to be this kind of uncontrollable force of nature.
Mhm.
What other uncontrollables did you foresee, or did you try to foresee, in terms
Mhm.
of planning these objectives?
Mhm. That's a good question. Um, Adjacent to the weather, the climbing conditions. So, snow and ice conditions on the routes. Maybe most significantly, the glacier conditions. So the peaks in New Zealand are pretty heavily glaciated, and as the season progresses, routes that travel up those glaciers become increasingly complex, or can even get fully cut off and be more or less unclimbable as crevasses and cracks in these glaciers open up. Um, so yeah, definitely the climbing conditions, other uncontrollables. Um, I mean, there's always unknown factors with a project of this scale. that have nothing to do with the mountains. So things like, road closures, or like just, like the grocery store closing at 8 p.m. and getting there at 8:15, like things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But nothing that you like specifically planned for, that you were like, okay, like there's this big black hole question mark that I don't really know what's going to happen. I'm going to try to prepare myself for it. There wasn't anything other than the weather and climbing conditions, which makes sense.
I mean, also certainly just the nature of the routes, as I mentioned, like there wasn't a ton of information available. So like, and a lot of the information that was available is like, oh, like the climbing here is all super chossy and scary. So just like not knowing for sure, like what kind of, like what amount of risk I'd be taking on soloing some of these routes. And yeah.
Rescue. How tangible was that? Were you completely protected the entire time? And how did that factor into your choice of objectives and when you're choosing these link ups?
Yeah, so one of the things that generally I love the mountains of New Zealand. I think they're some of the best mountains on earth. They're so beautiful. They're like the perfect combination of accessible but remote. Great for flying. Yeah, just in so many ways they're fantastic. One of the things that I don't love, and to be fair, this is a very important part and a significant part of the New Zealand economy, but there's a ton of helicopter traffic in a lot of the parts of these mountains. Not quite to the extent of the Alps, but way more than anything in North America. Especially in the more well-known areas. So in Mount Cook Park, up and down in the Tasman Glacier, it's just like a highway of constant back and forth helicopters. Or around Milford Sound. So there are certainly areas that are more remote, and there are times that I went for days at a time without seeing a single aircraft. But yeah, the Kiwis love helicopters, which is like the terrain. The terrain is super rugged. It's hard to get, like, even a lot of the climbers are using helicopters to approach
get
routes.
in and out.
Just because so many of the approaches, a lot of the approaches are just like, they don't take too long. Like they're rarely more than a day. But a lot of the approaches are like a full day of like really rugged, just like bushwhacking, creek bed travel, heinous, like low elevation glaciers that are all just, debris and post glacial moraine and like all this mess. So a lot of the
flying in past that stuff was not on the books for you. That was just like something you didn't consider. Yeah.
No, that was sort of one of my stylistic choices. But yeah, so ton of helicopter traffic. I was carrying, the satellite in reach, and that was kind of my first priority with my managing my electronics, was keeping that charged and keeping that turned on. So I had live tracking going straight to Dan, and probably my mom and several other people who were following, just like watching my dot pretty much all day, every day of the whole project.
Cool.
So yeah, between that and how common helicopter use is in New Zealand, for the most part, I felt pretty well covered if something were to go wrong. There were obviously certain days where I was out in a storm or out right before a storm where I felt a little bit more exposed, because you can't fly a helicopter in any conditions. They're a little bit more, you can manage rough conditions a little bit better than a paraglider, but if it's a full-on storm, you still can't go out and rescue someone. So there are definitely, there are definitely some moments where it's like a realization of like, oh, like, it's late in the day, it's going to be stormy tomorrow. Like if I mess up right now, like it would be quite serious.
Okay.
So it still definitely felt like committing big mountain terrain.
For sure. Yeah. Still with a small safety net in terms of like,
absolutely.
I'm not alone out here completely. Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to talk about some, we've talked about logistics, preparation. I think a lot of people are interested in the reality of the experience that you went through.
Mm-hmm.
And so my first question for this topic is, tell me what it's like to fly in a remote Alpine New Zealand environment. I send professional recording equipment to every single guest to ensure top-tier video and audio quality. And those costs add up. Right now, this podcast is also ad-free, and I would love to keep it that way. So if you'd like to help cover shipping costs and keep this podcast ad-free, please consider joining our Patreon. With as little as $3 a month, you can help support the show. You can find the link in the description below or go to patreon.com/the Climbing Majority Podcast. That's patreon.com/the Climbing Majority Podcast.
It's flying in general is one of those things that's almost indescribable because it's such a visceral feeling of specifically the moment of like, leaving the terrain and just being lifted by this little magic bit of nylon into the air, and then having control to just move and go pretty much wherever you want. Yeah, it's incredible. It's so freeing, and yeah, it's just joyful. Specifically doing that in the mountains here, depending on the conditions, there can often be as much or more fear and stress associated with a flight as there is joy. Inevitably, with a project of this type, where I'm doing all these big technical climbs and then trying to fly off, and then also just the dynamics of being in the big mountains, it's not going to be perfect flying conditions all the time. There's wind, there's thermals, there's just different types of moving air going on, which can, as I mentioned earlier, restrict where I can fly, or make the flight just generally less safe or less desirable because it's moving air. So a lot of the flights were absolutely scary, especially if I was going for a technical little landing zone where I had to put it down in some narrow little rocky creek bed. That's like, okay, I have to be really dialed. So there are definitely some flights that were more stressful than fun. But for the most part, well, and then I guess I should address the sort of the other side of the coin, which is that some of the flights were perfect conditions. I didn't have to glide to get anywhere, so I could do my favorite kind of flying, which is terrain flying, where I'm just swinging turns along the terrain. And some of those flights were some of the best memories of my life. Just the feeling of having spent hours and hours and hours climbing up this big technical mountain, enjoying perfect conditions on the summit, and then flying down through like the most incredible rugged terrain you've ever seen, and terrain that nobody climbs up because it's like big seracs and glaciers and towers and all this incredible terrain, and being able to move through this terrain so effortlessly, and just like feeling the magnitude of the mountain, but also moving with that magnitude so quickly and so efficiently and so easily. It's indescribable.
We talked about earlier in this episode that moment of overwhelming, blinding euphoria. Did you ever get to that point in New Zealand where you're like, wow, this is so sick. And then you're just like, wait, reel it in. Like, don't fucking break your pelvis again. Like, did you have a moment like that?
No, I can pretty confidently say that I kept more of a level head and more of an awareness, even in the most spectacular flights.
Cool.
Yeah, I definitely have.
You learned that lesson the hard way, so.
Yeah, I have much more of a healthy fear of flying now. Yeah, but yeah, definitely. So some of the flights, and me personally, I have a hard time like bringing a camera and filming all the time, for weird complex reasons. But because of Dan's support and also wanting to turn this into a film, I basically ended up filming every flight. And some of the footage, like, it was annoying to deal with the camera when I was doing it, but now, like, looking back and watching that and having that, it's so cool.
Yeah, so actually on that topic, it looks like you like almost crashed and lost the GoPro at one point, or lost some footage.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that experience.
I did lose a GoPro, and it was a bummer.
Yeah,
I didn't crash.
In the video, okay.
The main contributing factor, I think, was the helmet that I was using and the adhesive that we'd used to attach the GoPro to it, or the GoPro mount. Basically, it was really one of the dramatic and climactic moments of the entire project, which is why it's a little bit of a bummer that the footage doesn't exist, because it would be a great part of telling the story. But But basically, I was flying from Mount Tasman, the second highest peak in New Zealand, and one of the more aesthetic peaks on the list. I was just doing a short glide across to Torres Peak, which is a sort of a sub peak down the ridge. Great peak in its own right, big, complex, gnarly mountain. But because of its position next to Mount Tasman and below Mount Tasman, I decided that my approach to climbing it would be to fly off Mount Tasman and to land essentially on the top of Mount Torres, or Torres Peak. And the summit of Torres Peak, it's not big and it's not flat. It's just kind of like this steep sort of snow fin, this snow arete. But the conditions were just right. The wind was coming in such a direction that I knew I could sort of fly around it, sort of soar the wind coming up and just sort of stick it in right on the top, which I did. And it went fairly perfectly. But I kind of had to come in sort of like fast and aggressively to put it in right where I wanted to, and stood it up, landed on my feet. So it wasn't that hard, but I guess it was hard enough of an impact as I came in and just sort of stomped in because I didn't want to run off the side of the mountain. I stomped in and the camera just popped off the helmet and went tumbling off
man.
thousands of feet down the mountain into a bergschrund at the base.
To anybody listening that lives in New Zealand, please recover that GoPro.
I would be so impressed. Like, it's deep in a glacier at this point, underneath probably a giant pile of debris.
It'll be like one of those bodies that come out of the glacier like 100 years from now.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty large glacier. It's the Balfour Glacier, which is one of the bigger glaciers in New Zealand, and so it'll come out the bottom in maybe like 20,000 years. But yeah.
Yeah, it's like those time capsules that you made it as a kid, right? And you buried it. You're like, in 100 years, people will find this.
The real question is, in 10,000 years, when somebody finds my SD card that miraculously isn't ground to a pulp, and they watch it, is it going to be just like totally pedestrian and be like, oh yeah, like we fire little jetpacks after these all the time? Or is it going to be like a regress where people like don't even climb mountains anymore and they like rediscover
just a bunch of cavemen like, what is this? Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, time is a bitch, man. You never know what's going to happen.
But yeah, so the camera was lost, and it had footage from basically like I had 3 of the coolest days of the project right in a row, culminating in me losing the camera on the end of the 3rd day. And so basically some of the best. Yeah.
In the Instagram post that you made, you seemed pretty devastated about losing that footage.
Yeah.
And I mean, just 5 minutes ago, you had mentioned that you kind of struggle a little bit with like the balance between capturing the experience versus experiencing the experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, talk to me about kind of your mindset in terms of balancing both of those. Wanting to make sure that you have something to share for your sponsors, for Dan, for the world to see what you're doing, versus experiencing it in your own mind. Like, it seems like that was a pivotal moment for you in terms of kind of juggling that struggle inside.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of what was that mental process like?
Mm-hmm. I think throughout the course of this project, and after losing that camera, I was able to sort of just become maybe more accustomed to the camera in that it wouldn't affect my experience. It just became like another part of the routine. The main reason in my past that I've struggled a little bit with documentation is that I feel like that moment where like I think about like, oh, like I should film this, and then like, I'm faffing with the camera and stuff, that just kind of pulls me out of the sort of introspective, like fully immersed kind of like flow state experience of moving solo through the mountains, where all of a sudden, rather than thinking about what's in front of me, I'm thinking about like what the footage might look like to other people, and it's all these much more like complex thoughts about things that are going on outside of my personal experience. So yeah, I think throughout the course of the project, I just was using the GoPro so much and filming all these flights that it just became automatic, and that became less of an issue for me. But I think specifically the reason that I had a hard time, which it's funny because, you know, my past self from maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I was first starting to do bigger things in the mountains, and I kind of had like a no electronics at all rule. Like I wouldn't photograph anything. I wouldn't even bring electronic navigation. I would just like out sort of questing. Um, like if that Nathan knew that I'd lost this camera and I was like so torn up about it, I think that I'd like gone completely crazy and like fully lost like my style and my ethics in the mountains.
Yeah, all are in question. Yeah.
Yeah, but the reason that I was so torn up about it was because I think maybe for the first time in my climbing career, I'd done something that really felt like new to the climbing world at large, something unique, which was specifically climbing a technical peak and flying off and then landing on the top of another technical peak. Which is something that I only did a few times throughout the course of the project. And it's, you know, it's just like such a specific thing. Like obviously people have top landed on mountains before. But it's such a specific thing of climbing a technical mountain and then flying over to a lower mountain that is also technical and there's no easy way up it, and using that height and a small wing as a tool to get yourself to that hard to reach spot where and no, you know, nobody else had ever gotten to that spot in that way before. It's just like such a specific thing, something that's been done so rarely, and the fact that I'd been able to document it and was like, you know, ready to share it with the world, and then lost it.
It's gone. Yeah.
Yeah. And now, like, you know, I still did it. Like I have the GPS track, and to me, most importantly, you know, maybe selfishly, I have my memory of it, which is, you know, maybe more vivid and more real than any video could be. But yeah, just being able to show other people like what that looks like of launching off this one sort of spike of snow and ice and flying over and looping around this other spike of snow and ice and then landing right on the top of it. Like it's just such a just something so far removed from everyday life and normal life. It would just be incredible to be able to share that with people.
Yeah, man, that makes sense. I could see that for sure. It's definitely a lost thing to share. Something that's novel, right? Yeah. I think that, you know, brings me to one thing I want to talk about is I was poking through your Instagram and you took this video that was on the side of a cliff essentially, and you had just landed apparently in your crampons.
Yeah.
And like you're like filming yourself, and it's like this, I mean, I don't even know, fucking probably like 70-degree snow slope, you know, like your parachute's just, you know, like down, and you're just filming. You're like, that was probably the most epic landing ever, you know. Fuck all those people that say don't land with crampons, you know, because you have to use two ice axes to get out of where you landed from.
And I had to pack my wing up. But yes, basically standing on my front points so that I could take my axes out and keep it was completely and it's one of those things like I wouldn't do it again. But
so
like,
did that happen once?
The top landing I did a number of times.
But the one specifically that you shared on your Instagram where you were like on the side of a mountain, was that just once?
That was just once that I landed on something that steep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought that was like a normal thing.
No. So I landed on glaciers quite a lot, generally flat or close to flat glaciers. I landed on a couple of summits, which were also steep, but not that steep. Then there was that one landing in particular, which is on a peak called Drake Peak, where, I basically landed on like 50-degree ice. And that one, like that was basically my thought process there was like, it's a steep snow slope. It's got a big schrund. I don't know if I can cross the schrund. But I do know that if this doesn't work and I go tomahawking down it, like it pretty quickly flattened out below the schrund. So I wasn't saving myself a ton of vert. I was saving myself a schrund crossing. And I basically from the other summit and in the air evaluated the risk, thought about what would probably happen if it didn't work, and decided that I wouldn't die if it didn't work. And I was like, this is probably going to work. It is completely absurd. And again, it's very questionable decision making, not something that I would do again. But the fact that I did it is like, it's pretty out there.
A novel thing. Did you get that one on GoPro?
No, that was on the same. So that was the day
Oh,
before.
oh,
Um,
okay, okay.
and that was the same day that I'd flown off of Aoraki, Mount Cook. And yeah, so that was another day that I'd done. So I flew off Mount Cook, top landed at a peak called Mount Vancouver, which is also a technical peak, and then flew from Mount Vancouver to that 50-degree snow slope, climbed that mountain, and then flew from there all the way out to the hut that I slept in that night.
Wow.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
a
you were
pretty out there
joking. You're
day.
like, you were joking. You're like, yeah, next time I gotta fly with an ice axe in my hand.
It very almost felt like it. Like it was, I literally had to like fly. I mean, basically felt like I was flying into a wall. I used, flew my wing in, used all of my flare power at the last second, and then just like stuck my crampons into the snow
Wow. Wow.
and then just stood there. But
Epic.
it was,
Epic.
yeah, definitely an unconventional landing technique.
It's probably one of the first times that's ever happened, I would say.
Yeah, probably.
You're like, yeah, first and last,
Yeah,
even by
yeah.
myself.
I feel like maybe I need to add this to just the whole podcast episode, but to this in particular, I feel like I need to add like a "do not try this at home" asterisk. It's like don't land on 50-degree snow. It doesn't work.
Not advised. Not advised. Okay, so we've talked a lot about air technicalities, issues with crossing, focusing mostly on the flight aspect of it. What about the climbing aspect of it?
Yeah.
What were some of the most technical link ups that you kind of were looking forward to, and what were some of the most technical moments that you ran into while you were on the climbing side of things?
Yeah. So a lot of the most technical sort of pitches, the most technical moves, if you were kind of surprises. The New Zealand's Alpine grading system is maybe much less refined, much less specific than the Yosemite Decimal System. It's basically just like a 1 through 5 scale, where 1 is like a pretty easy mountain and 5 is like a really freaking hard mountain. So almost all of the technical routes that I did were either grade 2 or grade 3. And generally what that meant was on a grade 2 route, I would be like doing kind of hard moves, but if I fell, I might not die. And then grade 3 would be like I'd be doing kind of hard moves, and if I fell, I probably would die. And so within that, I had grade 3 routes that were just like a total walk in the park, just like super fun, solid rock, equivalent to like maybe like a fourth class High Sierra scramble. And then I had other grade 3 routes that were like climbing, well, like doing like 5-7 moves on like gravelly choss.
Okay.
So pretty
Not
big
great.
range there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically going into these routes, a lot of the times, like I knew that it would be technical, but I didn't know if it was going to be like just sort of one pitch of like fun, solid rock fourth class, or like hours and hours of like horrific fifth class choss, um, because of just the nature of this grading scale. And the reason that it's so non-specific, um, is I think mostly to do with how conditions dependent these routes are and how much the conditions can change. Um, so a lot of the routes are climbed as, early season mixed ice and rock routes. Um, and so then if you go climb them late in the season, it's going to be a completely different experience. Or if you climb them earlier, if you climb them midwinter when they're fully snow covered, maybe it'll be a different experience. So yeah, basically the grading is non-specific. And so a lot of those hardest moments, I didn't really know that I was going into like, soloing this gnarly 5-7 pitch until I was standing below it and be like, oh, like this is going to be full on.
And it seems like it wasn't more technical difficulty, but like slightly technical terrain on just a bad quality rock, or it's like very insecure.
Yeah. So there are definitely exceptions. There are a few peaks that were fantastic climbs that would be classics anywhere in the world with great rock. But as a general rule, yeah, the rock is pretty bad. And so it was a lot of the technical routes would be something like, you cross a glacier, you climb a bit of like steep snow to gain a ridge, maybe, use some funky bergschrund crossing, you climb like, several hundred feet or maybe several thousand feet, depending on the mountain, of like 40 to 50 to maybe 60-degree snow to gain a ridge. And then you climb up the ridge, which is going to be like blocky fourth class, where, all the ledges are covered in talus and the steep bits are like mostly solid, but you can definitely just like pull stuff out, but you can find solid stuff in there as well. So that's kind of the general nature of the climbing.
How much time would you say you spent in the no fall zone while climbing?
Like total throughout the whole project?
A percentage. Yeah, like 50%. I mean, and I'm talking about like, obviously the approach doesn't count. Like when you start to get to like, steeper terrain, how much was it what percentage of your time did you spend in the no fall zone?
I would say maybe, this isn't a exact answer to your question, but I would say maybe half of the peaks that I climbed, maybe more than half, maybe 65% of the peaks that I climbed had no fall terrain somewhere on them. And of those ones with no fall terrain, it was maybe like for the whole course, hard to pick where you're picking as the base, but base to summit, it would be like the upper third usually would be like no fall kind of terrain. But obviously it varies a lot peak to peak. I would say that the most dramatic outlier of that would be peak number 99, Mount Sefton, which is a route that's like it's 8,000 vertical feet in like 2 horizontal miles, and it's technical and no fall the whole way.
Wow. And that was the second to last?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was, and that one was like for the most part quite good rock. That's an absolutely classic climb, the North Ridge of Mount Sefton. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
What about this death rock that almost took you out? What happened there?
You're talking about the one on Dilemma?
Yeah,
Dilemma
the one
Peak?
that you pushed back in place before you let it fall.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what happened there?
So this was quite early in the project. I think I was like maybe 2 weeks in. And I was climbing this peak, which is, very comfortingly named Dilemma Peak, which isn't actually on the list, but just because of the structure of the mountains, I had to traverse up and over its summit to get to another peak behind it called Unicorn Peak. And just, the ridges are generally the easiest way to approach these peaks. The faces are normally steep and even maybe worse rock than the ridges. And so I was traversing out up and over Dilemma Peak to get out to Unicorn. This was still November, so it was early season conditions. It was some mixed ice and snow. I was climbing up a gully that essentially had a stripe of snow and ice in the back, but some blocky rocks stuck into the gully. And yeah, it wasn't massively exposed. It wouldn't have been thousands of feet of free fall, but it probably would have been a death fall if I'd fallen from there. It was a steep gully, 50 plus degrees, 60-degree gully, with jagged rocks and stuff. So I'm climbing up it, I'm stemming up it, picking my way up, choosing the right rocks to pull on. I had my tools out and I was kind of alternating back and forth between using tools in the ice and hands on the rocks, because the ice sort of dribble in the back was a little bit sporadic. And so I get to this point where I'm stemmed somewhat insecurely. I have my crampons on, but my crampons are on rock, which is never the best feeling when you can't feel your toes on the rock. Yeah. I'm standing on my crampons, stemming out on the rock, and I pull on this. I pull on this block, and I didn't even pull on it. I actually just kind of wiggled it to test it, and it was this block that was maybe microwave size, but if you squished a microwave a little bit, the edges oozed out a little bit. So it was good size. It probably weighed 100 pounds, and 8 inches thick, big flake thing. And so I wiggle it, and it just falls out of the crack that it was in. The whole trickles of dirt coming down the sides and stuff. It was not frozen in place, which is kind of surprising because it was in the back of this kind of snowy gully. But yeah, so it comes out, and I basically just have to engage my entire core and upper body and all of a sudden all this extra weight was transferred onto my feet that I'm stepping on. So I just like hold it in place, kind of consider my options, and I like the goalie was narrow enough that like I couldn't really just like maneuver it past me. Like the block was coming out. There was no way that I could set it back in and have it stay there. So I knew the block was going down. I knew that I couldn't just move it past me. So basically what I ended up needing to do was um get my tools somewhere. I think I just had them up above me and use a palm press on one side to move my upper body out of the way and let the flake sort of fall past me and then return back to the stem, to the secure stem. And it worked out fine. It's one of those things that it's like I think Honnold actually mentioned this, where it's like when you're soloing and like shit goes wrong, it's hard to know how close you actually were to dying if you didn't die. But it's definitely a moment that's like I really wouldn't want that to happen again, because it definitely felt closer to the edge than I would have liked. If things had gone differently, the outcome certainly could have been different.
Yeah, if it had been 100 extra pounds, maybe your crampons would have blown.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if I had misjudged the angle and it had caught my jacket on the way by, like, but I mean, you can't speculate too much about those things, because maybe there's a lot of things that could have happened in the other direction. I wouldn't have even known that I was in danger at all.
Exactly. It was just the one thing that was in the forefront of your experience, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Wild, dude. Wild.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about your sunglasses.
Yeah.
And the lack thereof. What happened with that story?
Yeah. So, a little bit of background on the sun in New Zealand. I feel like it's been a significant enough part about my life now. I need to do some concrete research and actually find out. Basically, everyone says that like above New Zealand, there's like a hole in the ozone, or like the ozone layer is thinner. I don't know what the actual cause is. The sun here is quite intense, and when you're out on the snow, especially, there is a noticeable difference between being on a glacier in the sun here versus somewhere of similar latitude in the northern hemisphere, like the North Cascades, for example. It's definitely more intense. And so, yeah, I had this big 6-day link up that I was going in for. I think it was 8 peaks in 6 days up the Hopkins River Valley. Really remote peaks, super long approach up this valley to get into them. And yeah, so basically on the first day, I woke up that morning, I checked the forecast. The forecast looked okay, but not awesome. I had like a couple of these flying link ups that I was planning on doing that were like somewhat committing, where it's like, I'm going to fly off this peak to get out to this peak. And like, if I can't fly off that far peak, I'm going to be walking out for like 3 days. Versus if I can't fly, it's all going to be sweet. So it was like somewhat committing flying, and the forecast had like some good windows, but also like it wasn't a perfect forecast. And so I spent the first morning, like I wasted like 3 or 4 hours just like waffling, like sitting in my van with like this decision paralysis and like anxiety, just like trying to decide if I should go in or not, essentially, because it was a long walk in up this valley. And once I was in, like I wanted to get all the peaks done, so I didn't waste the time walking in and out. And so I was like waffling, like, oh, like, should I go climb something else for 2 days and then come in? Like maybe the forecast will be better. And eventually just, got ready and headed out. And so yeah, because of that late start, the first day, the long approach just ended up going into the night, and ended up doing some like pretty heinous, they call it bush bashing here instead of bushwhacking.
I saw that.
But yeah, so I did some bush bashing into the night. So, and then eventually got to my little hut at the end of my approach. And when I got to the hut, and I got to the hut at like maybe midnight, I got to the hut and I'm unpacking all of my things and realized that I'm telling this wrong. I get to the hut and I go to sleep because I'm freaking exhausted. I wake up the next morning and keep going and do more of the approach, and I'm basically like up in the upper valley, this place that had taken a full day approaching to get into, and the sun comes up mid-morning the next day, and I go to put my sunglasses on and realize I don't have them, and best I can figure is I lost them in that bush bash. They had been like maybe on my head or around my neck or something, one way or another, I'd become separated from them. Um, and I wasn't going to go back because I knew it was massively improbable that I would find them. Um, and I wasn't going to walk out because I just spent a day and a half approaching these peaks. And I was like, well, I'm in here, like I'm just going to climb them. And for a couple of days, like everything was pretty sweet. And climbed a handful of peaks, did some of these committing flights. But I woke up on what should have been the second to last morning. So I had 3 peaks left. I had 2 sort of further out, and then one that I had to traverse up and over to get back home. At this point, I'd worked my way to the next valley over, and woke up that morning, tried to do my Alpine start at 3 a.m. to go climb the far out peaks, and like woke up and my eyes just felt like they'd been scrubbed with sandpaper, and just like I distinctly remember it was a full moon, and I got up at 3 a.m. It was full darkness, but the moon was up, and the light from the moon was enough to make my eyes hurt. And I couldn't look at the full moon. And then I was going to cross this river, and I couldn't even look at the reflection of the moon on the river. And I was like, "Ooh, like this is not good." So made the decision to bail on those 2 peaks. The 2 peaks that I was going out to do are both heavily glaciated, big glaciers. Like, they're kind of like almost unique in the list in the sense that they have like really long sections of glacier travel. And I was like, I can't go do that right now. I just like need to get out and recover. And so, but I still had to climb up and over this one peak. And I could have gone like a slightly shorter, like I could have climbed up and over the shoulder of it, but I almost had to climb the entire peak anyways. And I was like, okay, like I'm just gonna do my best and try to get this one peak on the way out. Mount Ward, it's called. And it basically took me easily twice as long as it should have, because I was like, going up this boulder gully to like sort of alpine talus field, and essentially doing the whole thing with my eyes closed because it hurt so bad to open them. And I would just like, squint and just like open one eye a tiny bit and like plan my next bit of route. I was basically making route finding decisions based on where there were little bits of shade from these boulders, rather than the actual best route to do, because it hurt so badly to open my eyes in the sunlight. And so I'd like, squint an eye open, kind of just like feeling my way up this riverbed for hours and hours and hours, with just like a massive headache and just like a ton of pain coming from my eyes. And eventually got to a point high on this peak where I had to cross a glacier. And I get up and I was still hundreds of feet away from the snow, and it's just like this like beaming like beacon of hate, of pain, and just like I can't go there.
Yeah.
But I was like, well, I have to go there, and even the squinting technique wasn't going to work, and so I made myself that duct tape mask that that photo has gone around a little bit now of me with
It's
this
almost
like
yeah, it's almost as iconic as Colin Haley's avalanche photo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah. So
you made like little slits, it looked like. Yeah. It's
Yep,
like
yep,
rudimentary, archaic. It's
Mhm.
it's gnarly. It's a gnarly
Yeah.
visual.
Yeah. Yeah. And the inspiration I got from that was actually, I mean, it's a known technique, but specifically the reason I thought about it was an Instagram post that I saw about like Inuit people make and like they're like whalebone glasses with little slits in them.
Ah,
And I
okay.
remember that, and I was like, oh, like that'll work. So yeah, I
Yeah.
made this duct tape mask, rocked like the crazy Darth Vader look, and was able to get up this glacier, and then actually ended up having to do like a pretty technical alpine climb on
Oh
rock at the
shit.
top of the glacier, with basically like no depth perception because I could only open one eye at a time.
Oh,
Um,
even with the mask on.
yeah, I took the mask back off for the climbing because I needed to be able to see to some extent. But yeah, basically it was like a pretty like very like memorably uncomfortable day.
Yeah. Did you fly that day too?
I did end up flying. Yeah.
Damn.
Um yeah. And fortunately by the time I was flying it was late in the day, and there had been some high cloud cover that came in, which I don't think I would have, like I couldn't have flown in direct sunlight. But it was later in the day, there's some high cloud cover. I didn't fly off the summit. It was actually a little bit too windy, and I dropped my heavy pack because I wanted to just make the technically climbing as easy as possible. So I climbed up to the summit, down climbed, went back down sort of a different part of the glacier, and then was able to get launched and fly out. But yeah, got out from that just like completely like, pretty physically wasted, very, very mentally wasted, just like total mental fatigue from like, dealing with that discomfort for so long.
How long did it take you to recover from that?
Uh, the it was really bad. Like I didn't want to go outside for maybe the next like 2 days, 48 hours. And I still had like some amount, like I could tell there was some amount of damage still healing for at least a week.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's
Fortunately,
crazy. It's crazy. It's one of those things that like you don't know that you have it until you're fucked, right? It's like it wasn't until you woke up.
yeah. The interesting thing, and like I've had other times where I got like minor snow blindness and it was like quite uncomfortable as it was happening. Um, but that time, like the day before, which is when the worst of it happened, because that's when I was spending the most time on snow. The day before, I'd done two big peaks. They both had significant like snow sections, and I don't remember it bothering me at all. Like I had to squint my eyes a little bit, but like I was totally fine. So like I didn't really think, like if I had been smart, I would have done the duct tape mask then, and it would have prevented the damage initially. But I just don't remember it bothering me very much. Like and did two flights that day, did a long flight that afternoon, and I landed that afternoon, and everything felt totally normal. But then slept for a few hours and then woke up and just like somehow the downtime of sleeping or yeah, just something like the damage became very apparent.
Yeah, you cooked your eyeballs.
Yeah, yeah. Would not
It's
recommend. That's
wild.
another don't try it at home. Wear sunglasses, people. And
Yeah, it
needless,
said you bring an extra pair now.
yeah, yeah. So for the whole rest of the project, and probably for the rest of my life, I brought two pairs. Yeah.
In terms of two other kind of like things that happened, one of them was spraining your ankles on peak 80 out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through that experience. What was that like?
Yeah. So this was on Mount Irene, which is the southernmost peak on the list. It's in a area called the Fjordlands, aptly named. It's just some really rugged, remote terrain. There's it's a big part of the southern, like kind of the southern tip of the South Island that doesn't have any roads. Um, it has several big lakes on one side that form these freshwater fjords going back into these mountains, and then the coast on the other side also has fjords. So it's this really interesting bit of mountains that's just kind of like has all these channels of water going into it, and then these really rugged and remote mountains. It's a beautiful place. It's a really, really, really spectacular place. Um, and just like not a lot of human traffic, just because it's hard to get into. And um, there's basically so I was climbing the peak in the middle of it, um, trying to do so without using any like motorized access other than a two-wheel drive car. So I like drive to the town, which is kind of on the edge of the Fjordlands, and paddled a sea kayak for 20 miles up an arm of this lake. So kind of spent the whole first day paddling a kayak, which was super super lovely. I got good conditions. It was light wind and just had this really awesome kayak up this long winding fjord with huge peaks coming straight up out of the water on both sides. Um, and then from there had to do like 8 hours of bush bashing up this valley, this seldom traveled valley, just to get sort of up into position and up into the Alpine. And that's not that part wasn't a huge distance. It was only about 4 miles, I think, but it's really really dense bush, and so there are some sections that were just quite slow. So yeah, basically I guess I did that whole approach in one day, but I spent 6 hours paddling and then 8 hours bush bashing. That was a full day just to get into position, not even at the base of the peak, but just to like start the traverse out to the peak. So I bivvy there, and then the next day spend the whole day kind of doing this high alpine traverse, and it was non-technical. These peaks they kind of have these big sort of broad shoulders. So they have technical rocky ridges, but then kind of like high shoulders that are just like open granite, or rock slabs, and like grassy slopes. Really beautiful terrain, and great for this sort of aesthetic alpine traverse, kind of winding along the upper flanks of these peaks. Um, Lots of little like alpine tarns and ponds up there. And yeah, very, very just otherworldly scenery. I think I have this little video clip of me just sort of being goofy, being like, oh, like I don't know where I am, like I'm on some other planet, like this is all so bizarre.
Yeah.
Just totally different from any of the other mountain scenery that I'd been in, and just felt, completely alone out there, completely isolated. It was great. Like it's super memorable. So I go out, I climb the peak. The peak itself was actually like the least memorable part of the whole trip. It was non-technical, just like a little talus log. It was nice. I climbed up it. I flew off it. That was all sweet. Um, and so then I'm reversing back across this traverse, and there was one section where there had been like the traverse had been forced a little bit lower elevation below one of these ridges. And there was just a short little section of like kind of nasty bush bashing, not terrible, but like annoying. And I realized on my way back, because the shape of the terrain, that I could fly off this ridge and just do a short little flight, like maybe 30 seconds, to bypass this section of bush bashing. And so it's like a 30-second flight to save myself like 20 minutes of bush bashing. Um, and so, but the conditions seemed good, seemed all sweet. And so I pulled the wing out. It was like an easy grassy launch, quick glide across, pretty easy grassy landing. It wasn't like a flat field. It was a side slope, and the grass here sort of forms like lumpy, they call them tussocks, sort of these lumpy tufts of grass. But it was the type of flight that I'd done a bunch of times before throughout the project, and a landing that I would consider generally non-technical. Not as good as a football field, but pretty good. So I come in, lands fine, but as I'm landing, one of my feet comes down weird on one of these tussocks, and just kind of stepped hard onto it and turned it weird, and heard a big loud pop, and then a lot of pain. And the pop was loud enough that I thought I'd broken it. I haven't really
Wow.
had ankle issues before. Like I'd never really sprained one or anything. Like I've rolled them a little bit on trails and stuff, but never
Hmm.
had like a proper sprain. And so because of the sound and the pain, my first reaction was that I'd broken it, and that like I was like totally screwed and I was gonna have to get airlifted immediately. Um, but I kind of sit there for a second and sort of self-diagnose and wiggle it around a little bit and poke and prod. And like, okay, like it hurts a lot, but I'm pretty sure all the bones are intact. Like nothing's moving weird. And it was pretty late in the day. It was maybe 2 hours before sunset. And I still had another maybe like mile of this alpine traverse, or 2 miles of this alpine traverse left. Um, and so I was like, okay, well, I'll just hobble along and see how it goes. And so I start sort of limping my way through, did a decent amount of like crawling and butt scooting on the talus sections. Was basically able to put weight on the ankle kind of straight down, but I couldn't articulate my foot at all, or it'd be quite painful. So I kind of just like had this like peg leg thing on one leg, and sort of limped my way back down to my bivy. And got there a little bit after dark. It was like raining, just like cold, miserable, in a lot of pain, just generally feeling sorry for myself. And basically at that point had the mentality that like if it was any worse at all, or even the same, like if it wasn't a significant amount better when I woke up, that I was probably gonna have to call for a helicopter rescue. Just because I still had this like 8 hours of heinous bush bashing to get out. Um, so I go to bed in like pretty poor spirits, and wake up, and I kind of test out, and it felt a little bit better. It was quite swollen, and I'm wondering if maybe just the swelling is why it felt better, because I was like acting as some kind of a splint. But
Splint,
it's
yeah.
yeah. So it's and I had taken some like ibuprofen and stuff, but um, yeah, it's quite swollen, and I was like, but then I tested out, and I was like, okay, this kind of works. Um, and it's kind of weighed the possibilities. It was a good weather day that day. there's some high clouds, maybe like a couple of showers, but definitely a day that you could fly a helicopter on. And the spot where I was bivvied was right next to this alpine meadow that would be like a perfect LZ for a helicopter. And I was like, I can push this button and they can for sure come land right there. But if I start bush bashing, like they're not gonna long line me out of the forest.
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna get below tree line and I'm gonna be like just kind of in it. So I sort of felt like it was like a bit of a decision. Like I could get rescued really easily. If I start, you got to do it. And I decided that I was mobile enough to get myself out. Did briefly entertain the possibility of climbing just like an adjacent mountain that was a couple thousand feet above my camp to skip the bushwhack to like climb this mountain and fly out to the beach where my kayak was, which is actually something that I'd sort of like initially like kind of planned on. But I knew I decided not to, specifically because with my ankle in the state that it was, I knew that would kind of compromise my decision making and my risk management. Basically, I knew that if I got to the top of the mountain, I would try to fly no matter what. Like it could be terrible conditions, and I would still try to fly because I wouldn't have like the mental fortitude to like go back down and do the bush bash on the painful ankle. So I was like, okay, I don't want to put myself in that position where my risk management is going to be compromised. So I'm just going to do the bush bash. Like I know I can do it. I know I won't die. So I spent the whole day just like thrashing through the brush with this peg leg ankle. And I got out and then I paddled my kayak out and then, passed out in my van. And
wow.
Yeah, this is a big adventure.
Wow. Yeah. How close were you to pressing that button?
I thought about it really hard for sure.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Was there
and
you had said like, I can get myself out, so I will. I think that's like a clear statement to why, but is that it? Is that like the surface level, reason why you did it? Or is there like something slightly deeper that kind of like maybe a level of morality or a level of mountain ethics that you have for yourself that made you kind of like make that decision?
Yeah, no, it is definitely a matter of sort of aesthetics and maybe some amount of pride. Just with like, I've never been rescued before. I hope to never be rescued. And yeah, if I had, and also, part of my style of the project at large is to not use any motorized access into the mountains other than my 2-wheel drive van. And so, getting rescued from there, even though I'd already climbed the mountain, not doing the full effort out and back from my van under my own power would certainly negate that peak itself. Maybe in a way negate the whole project, like for me. But like if I had gotten a heli rescue and I decided to continue with the project for like my own ethics, I would have had to go back and climb that mountain again.
Got it.
Absolutely.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense.
So, yeah, and I don't know. It's any rescue, even one that seems straightforward, to some extent, is going to put other people at risk. Like flying a helicopter is dangerous. Landing a helicopter in the mountains is dangerous. And so, in a way, like that would have felt selfish as well. It's like this non-life-threatening injury. I know that I can get out. There's no reason to ask other people to risk any, like, it's not that dangerous. They're quite good at what they do, but it just doesn't feel reasonable to ask other people to take on this risk unless I like truly need it.
Yeah, you literally cannot get out. Yeah. Like if your ankle was like the other way or something like that.
Yeah. Like I knew that it would suck, but I knew that I could, and that I wouldn't die, and that it probably wouldn't get any worse. And so I was like, all right, yeah, we're just gonna make it happen. The kayak out ends up still being quite pleasant. You don't use your ankles to kayak, so
yeah, you just stick your foot out, put it in the water.
Exactly. Yeah, still enjoyed the paddle out.
Hell yeah. Last thing in terms of like things that you experienced in terms of things you overcame, a busted wing. Did your wing break mid-project?
Yeah, so this is definitely
the big one, right?
This is the big one. Yeah.
Okay.
This is certainly a bit of a emotionally charged memory for me. And yeah, definitely one of the most memorable parts of the whole project. It was actually it ties in quite a bit with the sunglasses story because it was actually on the same link up as the lost sunglasses. Just not a great week for me, I guess. So essentially, what happened was on one of those peaks on the trip up the Hopkins is actually Hopkins Peak itself. Um, I was launching my paraglider in fairly high winds. I would guess it was maybe blowing 18 miles an hour, something like that. Maybe 20. So not a totally unmanageable amount for that wing, but definitely sort of on the upper level of what's comfortable and safe to launch in, from a technical spot. And it is a technical mountain. It's steep on all sides. It's just kind of like a rocky summit pinnacle. And so I was using a technique, which is called the throw and go. It's the launch technique that I used for almost all the summit launches, which is essentially where you get clipped into your wing, and then rather than laying it out on the ground and then lifting it up into the air like you might have seen paragliders do, you bundle it up into a ball, make sure that it's oriented correctly, and then you throw it up into the air. The wind blows it back, and then the wing inflates. And basically, the reason that that's beneficial is because it keeps the wing from getting tangled in the rocks, because it has all these little lines attached. If you set it down on rough rocks and try to pull it up, it's just going to get caught on something. So it keeps the lines clear, keeps everything clean, and the wing is just in the air. It never touches the ground, so it can't get snagged or torn on any of the rocks. Essentially what happened is, I throw it up, and I hadn't lined everything up perfectly, so the wing, rather than pointing straight up and inflating and flying above my head, inflated, pointed a little bit to the side, and it flew to the side and caught just one wingtip, just like the outside line or the outside couple of lines caught on a rock, which turned the wing even more and pulled the whole wing into the rocks. And it happened with enough force that it also pulled me off my feet, and I was on a pretty steep bit of terrain, and so so my weight kind of swung beneath the wing, and fortunately, the wing tangled in the rocks enough that it kept me from falling off the mountain.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't a cliff, but it was quite steep, rocky terrain that I kind of swung down around the wing. So I basically ended up hanging from the wing, which was tangled in the rocks.
Wow.
And so that in and of itself was a scary moment. I don't think it was like quite a death consequence, but certainly could have gotten like pretty beat up if I had fallen further. So I climb up, pick my wing out of the rocks, assess the damage, and my first reaction is like, the wing is totaled. Like I need to walk down. I think there was one line that was severed completely, and then there were two other lines that had pretty significant damage to their sheaths. So paraglider lines are similar to climbing ropes in that they have a sheath layer and then a core layer. And the core layer is what's load bearing. The sheath is kind of protective and adds stiffness. So there's one line that was fully severed, and then two or three other lines that had significant damage to the sheath and maybe some damage to the core as well. And so I get up on top of the mountain, I get down out of the wind, I kind of get back over on the lee side, which was still steep. And I kind of get this little like snowy ledge bulge thing that I can lay my wing out and kind of pin it out with some like rocks to sort of assess the damage. And so I figure out what's been damaged. I look at the nylon, the material of the wing is all still intact. And I look at the lines and look at what's broken and look at what I have. I had one spare line with me, and basically decided that what I had and what I could do would be enough to make the wing flyable again. I was really motivated to fly the wing off the mountain because the route that I had just climbed was like pretty heinous. It was one of the more horrific routes of the project. Just like knife edge ridge, Jenga blocks, one of those that like you feel, climbing to the point where it doesn't feel 100% under your control of whether you stay on the mountain or not. It's like you're grabbing this block and you're like, I'm quite sure this block is going to stay, it could fall off. If it did fall off, it wouldn't be my fault. It would have just been the mountain saying like, "It's your day to die. Sucks for you." So I didn't want to downclimb it. And so I'm quite motivated to make this wing flyable. I use my one good replacement line to replace the fully severed one, and then the other breaks I essentially isolated using knots, which in hindsight maybe wasn't the best repair strategy.
Is it because you're shortening them?
Yes, that's not ideal, but more it's because of I'm sure you're familiar with this with climbing material. Knots add points of weakness because of the compression on the material. So like if you load test a Dyneema sling with no knots versus with an overhand knot in it, the one with the knot is much weaker. So for that reason, paraglider lines, they're not tied with knots. They have sewn loops on the end. So where it meets the wing or where it branches out, the line is folded back on itself and then stitched together with a tacking, similar to a climbing sling. So anyways, I stitch the wing back together. I do my throw and go again. I pull it up. The wing is flying just fine. I look at it. The line shortening was insignificant enough that it wasn't really changing the profile of the wing. I looked at it. Everything's, the wing looks good. I can feel it pulling on me. Like everything is staying attached. And keep in mind that there's only damage to, 3 or 4 lines, and you have a total of maybe, let's see, 3, 6, 9, 12, like 18 total, like main lines. And I was confident that it was going to be flyable. So I step off a mountain, and it did fly. It flew just fine. And it was definitely kind of a little more of like hold my breath, because like I said, it's a steep mountain. It's like this committing launch. I'm like diving off over this 4,000 foot steep face. So I fly off, and I'm like, and I'm like, oh, it's fine. So I fly the wing. I fly it over to the next mountain, climb that, fly it off, and I'm deep in the backcountry doing this link up, so I'm like kind of committed to like flying one to the next to the next. So I fly over to the next mountain, climb that, fly off, climb the one with the heinously burned eyeballs, fly off that. So I did 3 flights on the wing. And they're all just sort of straight glidey flights, and everything was totally fine. To the point that I I was still aware of it, but the fact that the wing had been repaired was not in the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, I mean, you'd already gotten to the point where you had proven its efficacy.
Yeah. And so the wing was flying fine. Everything felt normal. And so I was just, back to focused on, the project and, my sunburnt eyeballs and whatever else is going on, the wind conditions, all this. So I fly those 3 peaks, and then I get out and I get to my car, and I think I must have taken a rest day because of my eyeballs. And I'm like messaging other like New Zealand pilots, like, hey, like who has extra lines? Like, where can I get some replacement lines for this Bantam? And found someone who had some spare lines for me, and sort of like organized like how I was gonna get them. And so kind of like ticked that mental box, it's like, all right, like spare lines are on the way. And then had another day. The lines hadn't gotten to me yet, but I had another day with an excellent forecast. And I was like, all right, the forecast is sweet. Like, I'm in the depths of this project. Like, I've been putting so much like effort and like, physical and emotional work into it. Like, I'm going to keep going. And so I went and climbed this peak that was like pretty straightforward, just a single peak, car to car round trip kind of thing. And, at the start of the day, I put the wing in my pack. It was the only wing that I had that was sort of like the appropriate type of wing for the project. And so I stuffed the wing in my pack. I head up, and I was like, oh, I'll see how the conditions are. And I get up to the top, and the conditions are fantastic. And so I pull the wing out and launch it because I'd already flown it a bunch of times. Like, I knew that it could fly. And I launch it, and I fly this whole big descent, and everything's totally sweet. And then right near the end of the flight, and I think it was maybe like it was quite a long flight because the air was kind of lifty, so I was able to sort of like soar some of the lifting air in a couple different spots. Right at the end of the flight, I kind of emerge from this valley and come out to a place where I'm somewhat close to this small airfield where they fly some of these tourist helicopter flights up into the Mount Cook region. And and I was aware of it and knew that I didn't want to be in the air near it longer than I needed to be. Didn't want to be in their way. um, and so I glided out, and I was basically like I was pretty much straight above my van. I was close to directly above my van, but still probably 2,000 feet above the ground. And I just start doing some like spirals as a rapid descent technique to go down quickly, and because they're super fun. And the one of the nuances of these mini wings is that they'll turn quite dynamically, but because they're are high performance and can fly flat like a paraglider, you can pretty easily induce a lot of G-force on these wings, even more so than on the small speed wings. So I'm doing these turns and doing these spirals and pulling quite a lot of G's. And this had been my fourth flight on the wing, and so I was not thinking about anything abnormal with the wing at all, because in my mind it was sort of a binary. It was like, does the wing fly? Yes. Is it giving me all of its normal feedback? Yes. I'm just going to fly the way that I normally would in this situation where I want to lose a lot of altitude. And yeah, so basically I do a couple of these spirals, and then I do one where I'm coming around and pulling a lot of force on the lines. And at once, at least two of the lines failed catastrophically, just fully broke. And yeah, so I immediately knew something was very wrong, because I felt the force of like punk, like things snapping. And it happened right as I was like pulling a lot of like, I am not good at guessing these things, but it was maybe like 3 G's underneath the wing. It's like pull, and it's like, oh. And for maybe, I mean, it felt like a long time, but for like maybe 1.5 seconds, the wing flew totally normally. But then, deformed because of the uneven loading. And, I did my best to correct, but basically it entered a configuration which is called a heli, which is where half of the wing is flying forwards and the other half is flying backwards. Which is actually something that you can do intentionally. And a lot of pilots in the specific discipline of like acrobatic paragliding, they'll do intentionally as like a trick move, are these helis. And then, they can, induce them and then pop back out of them and have the wing fly normally again. But mine was unintentional, and so half the wing is flying forwards, the other half is flying backwards. I'm heliing, and it's kind of pitching back and forth as well. I'm completely terrified because I felt completely out of control. I was doing the weight shift and doing the brake input that you normally would to get out of a heli, but it was such a deformation in the wing and such a discrepancy that I just couldn't get it to revert to normal flight. So yeah, basically, I wasn't free falling, but I had no control over the wing or where I was going, and basically just spun out of the sky until I hit the ground. Another technical aside is throughout the project, I chose not to fly with a reserve parachute, just because of the added weight and added bulk, and because on a lot of my flights, I was flying close to the terrain and wouldn't have had time to deploy a reserve anyways. But that's a whole discussion about that decision. But basically, helied into the ground, got really lucky that I hit in a spot that was steep grass. It wasn't rocky. I think even flat ground could have been significantly worse, but it was steep grass, which sort of transferred the impact, and walked away from it. It was totally fine.
Wow.
No. Yep. And walked down to my van and, just kind of sat shell-shocked for a while, and then called my mom and cried on the phone with my mom for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And this was halfway through the objective?
Yeah, it was right, maybe a little under halfway, actually.
And so, like, did you question your path forward?
Absolutely.
Obviously, yeah. Like, obviously, this isn't a situation where you blacked out and you're like, well, I don't really know what went wrong. It's like, I was flying with a broken parachute, essentially. And so the fix is very plain and simple. It's like, go get a fixed parachute, and then what is your fine? You'll be good. So, what about this moment, other than, I mean, the fact that you cheated death essentially made it so hard to consider moving forward?
The realization that I had pushed so far and gotten to the point that I was in a mental state that like flying that wing, putting that wing in my backpack to start the day didn't seem like an issue at all. Like I don't even remember it being a consideration. Um, which was directly a result. Like if it was a normal day of flying outside of a project like this, if I was just like in Salt Lake flying with my friends, I wouldn't even consider flying that wing, right? But I was just yeah. So afterwards, I had the realization that I'd gotten so deep into this project and so immersed. It was so like all consuming of my being that it had significantly changed my decision making and my risk management and just like my really like my evaluation of reality itself. So I came to a point, you know, in the days after as I was sort of wrestling with this, where you know at first I just didn't want to continue with the project. I was like, this is too much. I can't handle this mentally. It's affecting my decision making too much. I need to stop for my own safety. Um, as I started to move on past that immediate, maybe mostly fear motivated reaction, I came to more of a logical conclusion of like, okay, if I do want to move on with this, like I need to figure out a way to do it such that I won't like that I can be more self-aware and I won't get to that point where I'm, you know, becoming out of touch with reality and with my normal risk management decision making as it would be outside of the project.
And what were those kind of steps that you kind of put in place to keep yourself in that zone?
Yeah, I mean,
because it's easy to say like, oh, I won't do that again. You know, it's like it's easy to say that about anything. You know, like you make it. You know, you get arrested for speeding, and they're like, well, officer, I won't do it again. You know, like, and then you get let go, and you go out, and you're like, oh, well, I was speeding again. So like, what internal processes did you place for yourself to kind of like keep yourself in check?
So to sort of address your metaphor, the tricky thing about flying, you know, you certainly could make the same mistake twice and have it bite you multiple times, but it's such a complex thing that like you can make so many mistakes without ever making the same mistake twice, and you can still be making mistakes. It's like, yeah, like I'll never fly a paraglider with you know, shoddily repaired lines again, but there's still, you know, 1,000 other ways that I could kill myself with a paraglider. And you know, it's totally unsustainable. Like even if you're very self-aware and you're evaluating the mistakes after you've made them and not making the specific mistakes again, it's not like it's unsustainable to work through every possible mistake that you could make just because it's such a complex thing.
Because each mistake you make could kill you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically in the days after, I took several days off. It was actually over Christmas time, which I think made it especially emotionally difficult because it was my first Christmas away from my family. I've really strong connections with my parents and my siblings. I'm the middle of 5 children, and so for my whole life, you know, the holidays have been a really important time where we've all put in a lot of effort to spend time together and to grow closer as a family. So that was difficult for me, being away from my family, and then also wrestling with this, you know, big sort of almost like existential moment of like, can I make good decisions in the mountains while still, you know, achieving these goals that I've set?
So it almost got to a point where you didn't trust yourself anymore.
It felt that way for certainly at least a couple of days. Just because like in hindsight, it was like such a horrendously like blatantly poor decision. It was like just like trying to wrestle with like how I'd even been in a mindset that it was possible to make that decision. Yeah.
I mean, you're doing something over and over again, day after day. You know, there's a sense of numbness and familiarity you get with something. Even it doesn't matter how risky it is, and that's part of the dangers of climbing too. It's like you can get so comfortable doing the same thing over and over again, but then one mistake comes up and then you're fucked. And so it's like this, it's the same situation. You're just in that environment so much. It gets so comfortable and so normalized that, it's really easy to get complacent.
Well, and it's difficult to balance because to a certain extent, some amount of numbness to like the hazards of the mountains is necessary, because otherwise the fear barrier would prevent you from going out day after day after day. So it's this really difficult balance of like staying aware but without becoming too fearful or intimidated by the tasks at hand.
Was there a specific moment or a specific decision or thought process you went through where you were like, okay, I'm gonna continue moving forward this objective?
Yeah. So yeah, after a couple of days of just sort of emotional recovery and rest, I started to just look at the map again and sort of try to stay really in tune with the emotions that I was feeling as I looked at what I'd already done and what I still had to do if I was going to go on. Um, and yeah, for whatever reason, just found that it still felt like a important goal to me. It felt like something that I knew that I was capable of. In a way, it felt more difficult and more intimidating than it had at the start, even though I was halfway
Yeah.
through it and I had already
Mm-hmm.
done it. I'd already like proven the concept. But in a way, going back in with the knowledge that like I had to approach it differently and with more self-awareness, and I couldn't just like be like going for it all out as I had been at the start.
It's almost like
That
you're starting over again.
Yeah, it almost felt like a different project. It felt like a
Mm-hmm.
new a new um a new goal. Um and yeah, basically just sort of laid out some rules for myself of how I was going to approach the rest of the peaks. Specifically things like, really putting effort and time into not only researching but also like visualizing and in a way kind of like making peace with the descent options other than flying. um, it's weird. It kind of went from one dramatic, like one extreme to the other as I went through the early stage of the project, where when I was planning, I was quite pessimistic about how much I'd be able to fly. I was like, oh, like, I'll kind of like have these pipe dream link ups and maybe just like cherry pick, on like the one day a month that's like perfect for flying. Like maybe these will work. But for the most part, it's going to be a foot link up. But then, the conditions proved to be quite good and maybe better than in an average year with light winds up high. And all of a sudden, it just felt like everything opened up to me. It's like, oh, like I can fly off every single peak on the list. I can just like fly wherever I want, whenever I want.
Yeah, it got to the point where you were flying to skip a 20-minute bush bash.
Yeah, and just kind of sort of shifted the approach to I was looking at these mountains like expecting to be able to fly off of them and like committing to these flights or these climbs that like Hopkins for example, where it's like I would just go for this gnarly climb and just like plan on flying off. And so basically I really tried to shift the mentality for the rest of the project to where I would keep, and I did still fly a lot for the rest of it, maybe even more than I had in the early part of the project. But I was really trying to keep the mentality of I'm climbing this mountain with the possibility of flying off, but I'm very aware of and have fully like done the emotional preparation and keeping the awareness as I'm climbing of what's going to be involved for climbing back down, because that's going to be the mental default. And I'll probably end up flying because it's a gorgeous day and the conditions are perfect and I know there's a good launch up there and I know there's a good landing over there. But I'm still going to put in like the emotional work of like being ready to climb down. It's somewhat of like a subtle shift, but it felt significant as I was moving through the mountains.
That makes a lot of
I'm
sense to me.
ready to climb down all these mountains.
Yeah, you're not getting to the point where you're like, oh, it's not that great, and then all of a sudden you're talking yourself into why you should fly. You're like, oh, I'm going to do it in spite of these issues because I haven't even began to go down the mental process of accepting the fact that I might need to walk down this thing, down climb this thing, however it is you got up.
And I am proud to say that there were some peaks that like I was on top of and I probably could have flown off of, and it almost certainly would have been just fine, and I didn't, and I chose not to, and I was like, it's not perfect, I'm going to go down. So yeah, that was a big shift. And then also to a certain extent, I decided to slow down might be the wrong term, because I was still like really going for it and like trying to be maximally efficient, because that's kind of what that's the goal. It's not any time length, it's just like continuous like efficient climbing of mountains. And so I wanted to stay efficient, but there was a slight shift of like not being quite so desperate to like maximize every single day. So just like being okay with like taking an extra day when I needed to, taking a rest day when I needed to, and just trying to stay more in check with my mental state and my mental fatigue, because ultimately that's what proved to be far and away the crux of this project. It wasn't the physical load, it was the mental and emotional load for sure.
So that's actually a really great caveat to my next question. So in our last episode, I brought up the question of the differences between mental and physical struggle. And at the time, 2 years ago, you had said that they are the same thing. Do you still agree with that statement?
Absolutely not.
And so expand on
I
that.
think I should go back and listen to my previous episode, because
you might be a different person. Yeah,
I certainly
on yourself.
am. Yeah.
So expand on that a little bit. So why is it such a clear, stark difference now?
I think because now like I've felt like I've experienced what it's like to be like physically fresh and ready to go and have that energy and have that capacity, but still be like completely like mentally wasted and mentally unprepared to do a challenging, demanding thing in the mountains. Because I had a lot of days like I had times where like my body was ready to go, and I would get into technical terrain and my brain just like couldn't handle it. And the thing that I was being restricted by with like my pace and my movement and my enjoyment of the experience had nothing to do with my physical capacity. It was just 100% like the fatigue of my brain that was the limiting factor.
Mm. Yeah, just being able to be sharp and focused in this environment where you're having to go through so many different inputs and calculations and risk assessments and thought processes. It's exhausting, I bet, for sure.
I think the significant like a sort of cause of that change is that most of what I'd done in the mountains at the time of our last conversation was stuff where the physical effort was by far and away the leading cause of that mental fatigue. I was doing I was doing technical things in the mountains, like even something like the Cassin or like big days that I've done in the Sierra. I was doing technical routes, but all of it was like enough within my ability levels that the thing that was still causing like the mental and emotional fatigue was just being physically tired. Like that was maybe 80% or even 90% of the mental load. But on this project, just there were so many days that like the stress of the nature of the climbing or the flying or all these different things was enough more than the physical output that those became non-physical factors, just purely mental sort of intangible factors became the leading cause of fatigue for the day.
Yeah, makes sense for sure. That's cool. That's cool that you've chosen an objective so demanding that it's completely reshaped your belief on that topic. I think that's pretty powerful.
That is cool. Yeah.
So the paragliding world, it seemed seems to be very stunned with what you've accomplished. I don't know these people, but Benjamin Kellett said that it was quote unquote unbelievable and quote unquote super impressive and quote unquote a fucking crazy achievement. And has been one of the ones following your tracker along with his colleagues that are some of the most experienced climbers and paragliders in New Zealand, and they've all been blown away. How do you keep this recognition from the world that you're going to continue to receive as the world starts to hear about what you've done, separate from the personal reasons why you undertook this project in the first place?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. It is kind of a new thing for me, sort of what I'm sort of in the middle of experiencing right now, with sort of the amount of feedback that I'm getting. This, maybe a combination of like putting a little bit more effort into publicizing, combined with just sort of the novel nature of this project. Like I've just gotten a lot more attention than maybe I was expecting, or than I have from anything else that I've done. And so it's this new experience of like receiving tons and tons of messages from like people who I've never met and don't really have any close connection to, like wishing me well and like saying that what I did was inspiring or rad or interesting in whatever way to them. And yeah, I mean, it's great. It feels really good, especially like specific messages saying that like people have drawn inspiration, drawn motivation from what I've done to go do more than they would have otherwise, to go set loftier goals or put in more effort to something that they're passionate about. Like, to me, that's so gratifying. But yeah, how do I keep that from affecting my mentality for other big mountain projects? I don't know if I can. But I don't think it necessarily, like, I feel like there's a lot of negative connotation to that in the climbing world. It's like, oh, like, you're climbing for attention, or like, oh, like you're posting your sons for likes, or all these other things. But I don't think it needs to be a negative thing. I think that there's what I've done here was a direct result of me seeing something that someone else had done, or a lot of things that other people had done, but specifically referring to Don French and him climbing the list. So my experience, and me having this experience that was, challenging and difficult, but really like formative and expanding to my life experience, it was a direct result of somebody else doing something and then it being talked about online. And so yeah, it's like, how can that be a negative thing? So yeah, I don't think they need to be separated. But yeah, the question of motivation, of like doing it specifically for other people to see versus doing it because you love it, I think that becomes, I just don't think it's that clear cut. I don't think you can really separate those things as much as it seems like you could. Where
yeah, I think it's a matter of, especially when it gets down to maybe like, I don't know, again, I'm speaking out of term here because I don't have any experience with this, but like, let's say you get signed with a sponsor and they suggest a project rather than it being something that you stumble upon personally, or that you personally find a passion for. It starts, that's where I feel like the lines start to blur, right? It's like, what am I doing this for? Am I doing this because this is what's the most, publicized potential, or am I doing this because this is what really calls to me as an athlete or as a mountain man? So I think you're far from those kind of situations, but and I also don't think that there's any need for any sort of negative connotation to what you've done in terms of publicizing this achievement. I personally think it's quite the opposite. I think that and it's the reason why I'm sitting with you here, and the reason why I've started this project is because I think that is a common trope. I think in the climbing world is, people are sometimes kind of ashamed or discouraged from sharing their achievements because of X, Y, and Z. And so I think quite the opposite. I think it's important to share these stories and to celebrate achievements like this. So definitely don't, just keep doing what you're doing. Let's see here. I want to close this up. How do you feel now that it's done? It's done. We talked about, this in the last project, is this kind of post-send depression. And I think that the publicity that you have and the number of interviews I'm sure you're about to embark on, and this kind of post-send experience you're about to go through is going to carry this past, the normal kind of drop off that you would normally experience. But how are you feeling now that it's over?
Yeah, it's definitely been a very different emotional experience than finishing any of the other large projects that I've done in the mountains. Yeah, it feels really good to be done, to be honest. I mean, I'm well, to give some context, my family flew down from the US to be there on the day that I finished the list. Which it ends up being like a pretty idyllic moment of like, my last day, it was like these two big, steep technical peaks that are right above the, National Park Visitors Center, and there's like nice grassy meadows, easy place to access. So I climb these two big peaks, fly from one over to the other, climb that one, and then basically fly down, have this like spectacular like terrain glacier flight weaving seracs, and then land in a meadow with like my parents and girlfriend standing there. It was a pretty idyllic moment, except for the fact that on the landing, I was maybe I got a little bit wrapped up in the moment, but it was kind of like, it was a meadow, but kind of like a bushy meadow, and like, I land, touchdown, take 2 steps, and smack right into a bush, and trip over myself. But other than that, it was pretty idyllic. And so since then, I've just been sort of showing my parents the sights of New Zealand, and it's funny. We sort of joked that I gave them the like 100 Peaks Reader's Digest version, like 100 Peaks Light, because we went and we did it. We like hiked into a hut together. They went on tandem paragliding flights, and I actually got to fly at the same time as them, so we were all in the air together. And then we went out and did a sea kayak tour on Milford Sound, where I did some kayaking to access some of the peaks. So we got to go paddle, and I got to point out the peaks that I paddled out to. So yeah, it's been a really wonderful week, and I'm super grateful to them for coming down and for their support. So that's kind of been like a bit of a, kind of like an emotional buffer of like the transition from like finishing the project and moving back to, normal life, if you will, like sort of having this week of like, still, really getting out, having like a, busy itinerary, and just being able to share it with people that I love. And so, but yeah, the immediate emotional experience of that I have found from the other ones, of like feeling sort of purposeless and empty after moving on from this thing that was so demanding. I really haven't experienced that as much, and I think it's just because it took like more so than anything else I've done. It just like took so much that I'm just like I'm like ready to be done with such a demanding project for a while. And also like I still have this thing, flying, that I care more about and more invested in than anything else I've done in the mountains, and that's still like, I'm still in New Zealand. I have a couple more weeks here, and the weather's generally great, and so that's still something that I can like really actively pursue as I sort of transition out of this project. So yeah, for all those and maybe some other reasons, like it feels good to be done. I'm like excited for moving back to more of a normal lifestyle, and yeah, just grateful and proud of the experience, but not at all sad to see it be done.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Where so this achievement, I would say, not only was it, groundbreaking for yourself, but I would say it was groundbreaking for the development of the sport.
Hmm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but is the sport called speedmo? Is that a thing?
Yeah, so speedmo is a term that I think is coined by Jamie, a buddy of mine who's based in Salt Lake, specifically as a title for like skimo style races, but rather than using skis, using wings. So like doing a timed competition where you're doing maybe multiple laps on a hill, running up and flying down, running up and flying down. But yeah, I think sort of yeah, he's pretty keen to expand it to like a broader term for just like using a wing to move efficiently in the mountains, which I love.
So
Yeah, it's like
it would, like, the advance of speedmo would be like FKTs, essentially. Like you're introducing flight into FKTs for mountain peaks. Is that like
yeah,
kind of the next transition here?
possibly, yeah. Which is
Okay.
like it's a little bit of a, especially when you're talking about like single peak speed records, it becomes a little bit difficult, I think. And like it's certainly an exciting thing, but I don't know if it's like the most sustainable direction for the sport to be moving in for like specifically trying to go fast on a single mountain. Um, just because so much of flying is so conditions dependent, and like when it's this multi-day thing, I can spend as much time as I need to. I can spend an hour on top of a peak sorting out my lines, making sure everything is perfect before I go to launch. But if you're trying to do something like, say, beat the round trip Rainier record, it would be problematic anyways because flying isn't allowed in U.S. national parks. But if you're trying to beat the round trip Rainier record by using a wing to get down instead of skiing down, like you'd be doing like the most like haphazard, like sketchy transition. Like, I don't know if that's ideal, but I mean, on the flip side, like going fast in the mountains is inherently risky, and if that's what people are finding sort of their next big motivation and their sense of flow and of style in the mountains is trying to go really fast on a single peak using a wing, like that's fantastic. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be my focus.
Yours
Um,
is more just like the same style you've been carrying with you for the last 3 years, is link ups, using the
yeah,
techniques you have in the mountains to cover more ground.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's what's the most exciting to me right now. Yeah.
What's next? Do you have I would imagine you already have some and maybe you don't need to spill it here, but you can
Mm,
either just say yes or no, but do you already have a vision for what's next?
yes.
Good to hear.
No,
Good
yeah.
to hear.
I have ideas. Um, yeah, some stuff in South America, some stuff, all right, there's really aesthetic link ups that can be done, specifically like aesthetic link ups of multiple big technical alpine routes that can be done in the US that has the barrier of legality.
Okay.
Yeah.
You should climb Fitzroy and then wing to Cerro Torre.
That's what Dan said. He said the exact same thing. He's like, Nathan, can you top land Cerro Torre?
Yeah, you should top land Cerro Torre on the ice
Yeah,
mushrooms.
that would be next level for sure. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, hell yeah, dude. So psyched to have you sit here and so psyched to hear your story. I felt like I was right there alongside you for the entire adventure, and I'm sure everybody else listening felt the same. Such an amazing achievement, just groundbreaking on so many levels, and you're such a humble, kind of nonchalant human, and it's super cool to hear you talk about these things in that way. So yeah, I'm just really psyched to have you here, and I really appreciate you sharing your story here.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Yeah, it feels good to be able to, you know, put something out there that I'm proud of and that I can share with the world, and hopefully motivate other people to go out and chase big goals and do more of what they love.
That concludes today's episode, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. It really means a lot to me that you're here. If you like today's episode, please be sure to rate and review the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. This simple gesture helps the algorithm share this podcast with new listeners. Please also share this podcast with your friends. Word of mouth is honestly the best way to support the show. Also, if you're psyched about what we're doing here at The Climbing Majority, please reach out. DM me via Instagram or email me at theclimbingmajoritypodcast@gmail.com. I want to hear from you. And don't forget you can watch our full episodes on YouTube. The newsworthy nature of Nathan's story pushed Devin's episode back, and we will be hearing from him next. Until then, keep exploring, stay safe, and as always, thanks for being a part of The Climbing Majority. I will see you all in 2 weeks.